In the fertile valley of Oak Ridge County, 1883, a widow's weathered hands could tend delicate saplings at dawn and calculate artillery trajectories by dusk. Eleanor Sullivan had mastered battlefield strategy before most women her age had finished their schooling. But when the notorious Blackwater Company rode onto her land with torches and threats, they mistook her for just another helpless farmer's widow. That mistake would cost them everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat shimmered across Oak Ridge Valley, baking the golden wheat fields that surrounded Elmwood Farm as Eleanor Sullivan completed her morning inspections. The irrigation channels she'd designed last spring were working perfectly, guiding precious water through the drought-prone sections of her eastern fields. At 42, Eleanor possessed the kind of quiet dignity that commanded respect at town meetings, but it was her other talent, the one carefully concealed beneath practical work dresses and dirt-smudged gardening gloves, that truly distinguished her. Inside the Sullivan farmhouse, military maps and tactical manuals lay carefully organized in a locked cedar chest in her study. Beneath these were handwritten journals filled with combat strategies and defense scenarios, all bearing the name of Colonel Thomas Sullivan, decorated Union Army tactician and engineering officer, Eleanor's husband. What few people realized was that half of those brilliant defensive positions and supply line protections had originated in his wife's mind. A military wife should understand her husband's work, Thomas would say when teaching Eleanor the principles of tactical warfare, but a smart military wife improves upon it. Thomas Sullivan had recognized Eleanor's natural gift for strategy long before they married, often joking that had she been born a man, she would have outranked him within 5 years. The Sullivan name had become legendary during the war. Colonel Sullivan, the man who could transform any terrain into an impenetrable fortress with minimal resources. His defensive positions had saved countless lives at Antietam and Gettysburg, but Thomas had been gone now for 3 years, felled not by Confederate bullets, but by a sudden fever that swept through Oak Ridge in '80, leaving Eleanor to manage their farm and legacy alone. Eleanor paused by the kitchen window, her gaze drifting to the old oak tree where Thomas had been laid to rest according to his wishes, overlooking the farm he'd loved. Beside his headstone stood a smaller marker, their only son James, lost in the same fever outbreak. The pain had dulled with time, but never truly disappeared. "You've got visitors, Mrs. Sullivan," called a voice from the doorway. Sam Tucker, her foreman, stood with his hat in his hands. At 25, Sam had been one of many young soldiers mentored by Thomas after the war, and he'd stayed on to help Eleanor run the farm. "Railroad men again?" Eleanor asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The Central Pacific had been pressuring landowners in Oak Ridge Valley for months, trying to secure right-of-way for their new spur line. "No, ma'am. It's Sheriff Hollister. Says there's trouble brewing you should know about." Sheriff William Hollister was one of the few people who understood Eleanor's true capabilities. He'd served under Thomas during the war and had witnessed firsthand how the colonel had miraculously devised solutions to impossible situations after receiving letters from his wife. The sheriff occasionally sought Eleanor's counsel on matters requiring strategic thinking, though he was careful never to reveal his source of insight. "Eleanor," Hollister said, as he removed his hat, stepping into the cool shade of her kitchen, "the Blackwater Company crossed into Oak Ridge County yesterday." Eleanor's hands stilled on the coffee pot she was filling. The Blackwater Company, not officially outlaws, but a private security firm with a reputation for using any means necessary to achieve their employers' goals. They'd become infamous throughout the Western Territories for their ruthless tactics in helping wealthy interests acquire land and resources. "Central Pacific hired them?" she asked, her voice calm despite the implication. That's my guess, Hollister. Confirmed. 3 farms have already sold after accidents scared them off. Dawson's barn burned down last week. Miller's cattle suddenly broke through a fence and trampled half their corn. He paused, meeting her eyes. They're working their way south through the valley. Your farm is likely next. Eleanor poured coffee for them both, her movements deliberate and unhurried. William, my farm isn't selling, regardless of what kind of accidents befall it. I know. In that, Eleanor, Hollister said quietly, but these men, they're professionals, ex-military, some of them. They know how to apply pressure until something breaks. So do I, Eleanor replied simply. The sheriff's weathered face creased with concern. Thomas wouldn't want you facing this alone. Maybe consider the railroad's offer. Thomas would expect me to defend what's ours, Eleanor cut in, her voice gentle but firm. This farm isn't just land, William. It's everything he built for our future, everything we planned together. After Hollister departed, promising to check in daily, Eleanor walked to Thomas's grave. The evening breeze rustled through the oak's leaves as she stood in contemplation. They think I'm defenseless, she murmured, more to herself than to her husband's spirit. Just like you always said, let them underestimate you, Ellie. The greatest tactical advantage is being unseen. That night, by lamplight, Eleanor unlocked the cedar chest in her study. Her fingers traced the leather-bound journal on top, not Thomas's, but her own. Where her husband had been brilliant at adapting terrain for defensive purposes, Eleanor's specialty had always been in understanding how people moved, predicting their actions, creating scenarios that led opponents exactly where she wanted them. For hours, she studied maps of her property, making notes and calculations. When Sam arrived the next morning, he found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by diagrams. "Mrs. Sullivan," he asked hesitantly. "Sam," Eleanor said without looking up, "I need you to gather the men. We're making some changes to the farm's layout." Over the next 3 days, Elmwood Farm underwent subtle transformations. To untrained eyes, the workers appeared to be conducting routine summer maintenance, reinforcing irrigation channels, moving equipment between fields, repositioning hay bales and supply wagons. Only Sam understood they were following a carefully orchestrated plan. "The eastern fence needs to be mended," Eleanor instructed, pointing to a seemingly arbitrary section of the property. "Use the new posts in the north barn, and tell the men, I need those drainage ditches widened by the lower field, exactly 3 feet deep, no less." "Yes, ma'am," Sam replied, increasingly confused but trusting her judgment. On the 4th morning, Eleanor spotted dust clouds rising from the south road. Through her father's old spyglass, she counted 7 riders approaching, well-dressed men, on expensive horses, not the usual farm laborers or travelers who occasionally passed through Oakridge. At their head rode a tall figure in a black coat. Despite the summer heat, his silver-handled revolver visible at his hip. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized military bearing when she saw it. "The Blackwater Company has arrived," she murmured to herself, setting down the spyglass. "Right on schedule." Eleanor adjusted her apron and smoothed her graying hair into its simple bun. To anyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than a hard-working widow tending to her farm. But behind her calm exterior, her mind calculated distances, angles, and timing with the precision Thomas had always admired. "Remember what you taught me, my love," she whispered. "The battlefield belongs to the one who shapes it first." The riders drew closer, hooves kicking up dust from the dry summer road. Eleanor continued her work, seemingly oblivious to their approach. Inside, she began the mental countdown that would set her plan in motion. The leader of the approaching riders reined his horse to a stop at Eleanor's gate, the animal's hooves stirring small clouds of dust in the dry summer air. Up close, Eleanor could see the hard lines etched into his face, a diagonal scar running from his right eyebrow to his cheekbone, skin weathered from years in the elements, eyes that assessed everything with cold calculation. He matched the description Sheriff Hollister had provided. Victor Hargrove, former Union cavalry officer, now the commanding presence behind the Blackwater Company's operations. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Hargrove called out, his voice carrying a practiced politeness that did nothing to mask its underlying steel. "Mighty fine property you have here." Eleanor set down her basket of freshly harvested vegetables deliberately, taking her time as she straightened and brushed soil from her hands. She'd learned from Thomas that controlling the pace of an encounter often determined its outcome. "Thank you," she replied simply, pitching her voice to sound slightly uncertain. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Hargrove removed his hat. With exaggerated courtesy, "Victor Hargrove, ma'am. My associates and I represent certain investment interests in the region." He gestured to the men flanking him, a collection of hard-faced individuals whose relaxed postures couldn't quite hide their readiness for action. "We're surveying properties for potential business opportunities." "Investment interests," Eleanor echoed, injecting just the right amount of confusion into her tone. "I'm afraid I don't understand what business you might have with my farm, Mr. Hargrove." From her peripheral vision, Eleanor noted how the riders had positioned themselves, not clustered together as casual visitors might be, but spread at intervals. That allowed clear lines of sight across her property. Military formation just as she'd anticipated. She mentally adjusted her timetable, recognizing that these men were more disciplined than the average hired thugs. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Hargrove let the question hang. Sullivan, Eleanor Sullivan. A flash of recognition crossed Hargrove's face. "Sullivan? Any relation to Colonel Thomas Sullivan of the Union Army?" Eleanor allowed genuine surprise to show. "My late husband." "Did you know him?" Hargrove's smile tightened. "Knew of him. Brilliant defensive strategist, from what I heard. Never had the pleasure of serving under him myself." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard he passed some years back. Must be difficult. Managing such a large operation on your own, Mrs. Sullivan." "I manage well enough, Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor answered, her hand instinctively touching the locket at her throat that contained Thomas's portrait. "My husband taught me everything I need to know about running this farm." One of Hargrove's men, a wiry individual with a pockmarked face and tobacco-stained teeth, spat on the ground. "Whole valley's moving forward, ma'am. Railroad's bringing progress. Shame to get left behind because of sentimentality." Eleanor noted this man's demeanor, less controlled than the others, eager to intimidate. Every group had its impulsive element. Thomas had taught her to identify such weaknesses in an opposing force. This man would be the first to act rashly under pressure. "I believe Mrs. Sullivan hasn't heard about the recent troubles in the valley," Hargrove said, his tone solicitous while his eyes remained calculating. "Terrible accidents befalling some of the farms. The Dawson place had a fire just last week. Complete loss." "I heard," Eleanor said. "Sheriff Hollister mentioned it." "Did he now?" Hargrove exchanged glances with his men. "The sheriff is certainly attentive, but I fear even he can't be everywhere at once." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "The Central Pacific is offering fair compensation for land rights, Mrs. Sullivan. More than fair, considering the unpredictable nature of farming these days." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Eleanor allowed herself to appear momentarily flustered, clutching her apron as if seeking comfort. I hadn't considered selling. This land has been in my husband's family for—" "Progress doesn't much care for family history, ma'am," interrupted the pockmarked man, earning a sharp glance from Hargrove that silenced him immediately. "What my associate means," Hargrove continued smoothly, "is that change is inevitable. The smart play is to benefit from it rather than resist it." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Here's the railroad's initial offer. I encourage you to review it carefully. We'll return tomorrow for your answer." As Eleanor reached for the envelope, she noticed the holster on Hargrove's hip wasn't standard civilian issue. It was a military cavalry holster, modified for quicker draws. The other men carried their weapons similarly, positioned for efficiency rather than show. These weren't mere intimidators. They were trained fighters accustomed to coordinated action. "Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor said, her voice deliberately trembling slightly, "I'm a simple widow trying to preserve my husband's legacy. I don't want any trouble." Hargrove's expression softened, but his eyes remained watchful. "No one wants trouble, Mrs. Sullivan. That's why I'm offering you a clean, simple transaction. Others in the valley have already seen the wisdom in this approach." After their unfortunate accidents, Eleanor added quietly, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps. Respect crossed Hargrove's face. "Accidents happen, especially to those who stand alone against the tide of progress." He settled his hat back on his head. "We'll return tomorrow, Mrs. Sullivan. I do hope you'll make the sensible choice." As the riders turned to leave, the youngest of them, barely more than 20, with sandy hair and ill-fitting clothes, lagged behind. "Mom," he said quietly, "might we trouble you for water for our horses? Been a long ride?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the well near the barn. "Help yourselves." This request, seemingly innocent, confirmed another of Eleanor's suspicions. They wanted a closer look at her property, a chance to assess its vulnerabilities. As they watered their horses, she watched how their eyes catalogued the layout of her farm, noting entry points, structures, sightlines, exactly as she would have done when planning a tactical approach. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor saw Sam Tucker observing from the edge of the wheat field, his hand resting near the revolver he carried for protection against coyotes and other predators. She gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not yet." "Fine horses," Eleanor commented, approaching Hargrove as he stood by the well. "That bay has military training, doesn't it? The way he stands at attention." Surprise flickered across Hargrove's face before he masked it. "You have a good eye, Mrs. Sullivan. My husband loved his cavalry mount," she explained. "Taught me what to look for in a well-trained horse." She paused, then added deliberately, "Thomas always said you could tell more about a man's intentions by watching his horse than by listening." To his words, the message wasn't lost on Hargrove. His eyes narrowed slightly as he reassessed the widow before him. "Your husband sounds like a wise man, Mrs. Sullivan. I hope some of that wisdom extends to his widow." He mounted his bay with practiced ease. "Until tomorrow." As the Blackwater Company rode away, Eleanor remained by the well, her posture that of a concerned, slightly overwhelmed widow. Only when they disappeared around the bend did she straighten, her eyes hardening with resolve. Sam approached, his young face tight with anger. "They're threatening you, Mrs. Sullivan, plain as day." "Yes," Eleanor agreed calmly, "and they've just told me exactly how they plan to do it." She turned to him, her earlier vulnerability completely gone. "They'll start with fire, Sam. Tonight? Most likely, the eastern wheat field where it borders the creek bed." "How can you be sure?" "Because it's what I would do," Eleanor replied. "It's the most valuable crop, the farthest from the house, with a natural escape route along the creek." She began walking toward the barn, her stride purposeful. "Tell Jenkins and Martinez to move the water wagon behind the lower hayfield after dark, out of sight from the road, and check that the irrigation channels we modified yesterday are flowing properly." "Yes, Ma'am," Sam said, then hesitated. "Should I ride for Sheriff Hollister?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. Hargrove would have men watching for that." She paused at the barn door, looking back over the farm, her farm, with the tactician's eye that Thomas had helped her develop. "They think they're setting the terms of engagement, Sam. Let them believe that a little longer." Inside the barn, Eleanor unlocked a trunk hidden beneath sacks of feed. From it, she removed a brass spyglass and her husband's old service revolver, checking it with practiced hands that belied her farmer's appearance. "They see a vulnerable widow," she murmured to herself, "but Thomas didn't marry me for my vulnerability." She slid the revolver into her apron pocket. "He married me because I could outthink his entire regiment." As dusk descended over Elmwood Farm, Eleanor Sullivan prepared to meet fire with strategy and intimidation with a carefully laid trap years in the making. Twilight settled over Elmwood Farm as Eleanor Sullivan moved through her evening routine with practiced efficiency. To anyone watching from a distance, and she was certain Hargrove had left men to observe, she appeared to be going about the ordinary tasks of a farmer's widow preparing for nightfall. She fed the chickens, checked the livestock in the barn, and lit the oil lamps in the downstairs windows of her farmhouse. But beneath this veneer of rustic simplicity, Eleanor's mind worked with military precision. Each seemingly mundane action served a dual purpose in her developing strategy. "Jenkins," she called to one of her farmhands as she emerged from the chicken coop, "don't forget to leave the east gate unlatched tonight." She kept her voice loud, enough to carry, her tone suggesting nothing more than a routine reminder. "Yes, ma'am," Jenkins replied, catching her subtle nod. He had worked for the Sullivans for 15 years and understood that the instruction was far from ordinary. The east gate was always secured at night to keep predators away from the livestock. As darkness fell completely, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair on the front porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, despite the summer warmth. She kept a small oil lamp beside her and opened a Bible in her lap, the very picture of a God-fearing widow finding solace in Scripture before bed. Anyone watching would see a harmless, perhaps slightly pitiable figure. What they couldn't see was that beneath the Bible lay one of Thomas's tactical maps of the property, or that Eleanor's seemingly absent gaze regularly scanned specific sectors of her farm in a disciplined pattern. The rocking chair hadn't been placed for comfort, but because it offered optimal sight lines to the approach routes she'd identified as most likely for a nighttime incursion. "They'll wait until after midnight," she murmured to herself, turning a page in her Bible while making a mental calculation. "Hargrove is too disciplined to move earlier." At precisely 9 o'clock, Eleanor rose from her chair, stretched visibly, and carried her lamp inside. She moved from room to room, extinguishing lights in a pattern that suggested she was preparing for bed. The last lamp she left burning was in her bedroom, visible from the road, a beacon announcing her location to any observers. Once the house appeared settled for the night, Eleanor's true work began. In the darkened kitchen, she met with Sam and her 3 most trusted farmhands, Jenkins, Martinez, and Dawkins. These men had all served under Thomas during the war and understood military operations. More importantly, they were fiercely loyal to Eleanor, having witnessed her quiet intelligence during the colonel's lifetime. "Hargrove will send men to torch the eastern wheat field tonight," Eleanor explained, her voice transformed from the slightly hesitant widow to that of a commanding officer. She spread a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table. "Based on their assessment today, they'll approach along the creek bed, using it for cover." "Shouldn't we just arm ourselves and confront them?" Dawkins asked, his weathered hand resting near, the revolver at his hip. Eleanor shook her head. "That's exactly what they want. A direct confrontation gives them justification to escalate. Remember, they're portraying themselves as legitimate businessmen. We need to undermine that facade." "So, what's the plan, Mrs. Sullivan?" Martinez asked. Eleanor's finger traced a path on the map. "They expect to find a poorly defended farm with an east field ripe for burning. Instead, they'll encounter the first phase of our response." Her eyes, sharp in the low lamplight, met each man's gaze. "Hargrove is testing us tonight. Let's show." him just enough to make him reconsider his approach without revealing our full capabilities. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor outlined their preparations and response. The men listened attentively, occasionally offering suggestions that she considered with the same respect Thomas had always shown his officers. This was the Eleanor few people ever saw, the strategic mind that had quietly contributed to some of Colonel Sullivan's most celebrated military successes. "Remember," she concluded, "this isn't a battle we're fighting tonight. It's simply the opening move in a longer campaign." As the men dispersed to their positions, Sam lingered behind. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said hesitantly, "the men and I have been talking. If things get dangerous, I won't be taking unnecessary risks, Sam," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Thomas wouldn't have wanted that." She picked up her husband's brass spyglass from the table. "But he also wouldn't have wanted me to surrender what we built together to men like Hargrove." After her men had gone, Eleanor changed from her daydress into more practical attire, a dark skirt and blouse that wouldn't catch on underbrush or reflect light, sturdy boots that Thomas had custom-made for her years ago, and a wide-brimmed hat to shadow her face. Around her waist, she buckled a leather belt that held Thomas's service revolver and a small pouch containing other essentials. In her bedroom, Eleanor arranged pillows under the blankets to create the impression of a sleeping figure. She placed her nightgown visibly across a chair and left a single lamp burning low, creating shadows that would suggest her presence to anyone watching from outside. Then she slipped through a concealed door in her pantry that led to a root cellar. Thomas had modified the cellar years ago, adding a narrow tunnel that emerged in a small equipment shed 50 yards behind the house, an escape route designed during more dangerous times when border raids were common. The night air was cool against Eleanor's face as she emerged from the tunnel. She crouched in the shadows for several minutes, allowing her eyes to adjust fully to the darkness and listening intently for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of her farm. Satisfied that her movement had gone undetected, Eleanor made her way to an observation post she had prepared that afternoon, a modified hunting blind positioned in a dense thicket overlooking both the eastern wheat field and the creek bed beyond it. The blind offered excellent visibility while remaining virtually invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. From her vantage point, Eleanor could monitor her property and direct her men using a system of lantern signals they had established earlier, arrangements that would have made Thomas proud in their simplicity and effectiveness. As midnight approached, Eleanor settled into the practiced stillness she had learned during countless hunting trips with her father and later with Thomas. Her breathing slowed, her senses heightened, and her mind achieved the calm clarity she needed for the task ahead. This duality had defined Eleanor's life for decades. To the world, she was Mrs. Sullivan, the Colonel's widow, respected but underestimated, viewed primarily as the caretaker of her husband's legacy rather than as a force in her own right. Few people suspected that behind her gentle demeanor and capable homemaking lay a tactical intellect that matched or exceeded that of the decorated officer she had married. Thomas had recognized her gifts from the beginning. During their courtship, he had been stationed at an outpost plagued by supply line difficulties. When he mentioned the problem in a letter, Eleanor had responded with 3 pages of detailed analysis and potential solutions. Rather than being offended by her presumption, Thomas had implemented her suggestions immediately, earning commendation from his superiors for his innovative approach. That pattern had continued throughout their marriage. Thomas would discuss military problems with her, valuing her unique perspective and incorporating her insights into his official strategies. "You see patterns where others see chaos, Ellie," he would say. "That's rarer than courage on a battlefield. Now, As Eleanor prepared to defend their farm against men who saw her only as an obstacle to be removed, she found comfort in applying the skills she and Thomas had refined together over years of intellectual partnership. A faint rustling from the direction of the creek bed snapped Eleanor's attention back to the present. Through her spyglass, she detected movement, darker shadows separating from the natural darkness along the water's edge. She counted 4 figures moving with the purposeful stealth of men trying to avoid detection. Eleanor allowed herself a small, grim smile. Hargrove's men were exactly where she had predicted they would be, following the approach she herself would have chosen for a covert operation against the eastern field. Right on schedule, she whispered to herself, reaching for the covered lantern at her side. With practiced movements, she flashed a brief signal. 2 short bursts of light that would be visible only to Jenkins, positioned in the old oak tree. At the edge of the property, the signal transmitted a simple message: Operation begun. Proceed as planned. Eleanor Sullivan, the unassuming widow, faded completely as Eleanor Sullivan, the strategist, took full command. The farm that had seemed vulnerable and poorly defended in daylight was about to reveal the first layer of its carefully constructed defenses, and Victor Hargrove's men were walking directly into her trap. The 4 men from the Blackwater Company moved with practiced precision through the shadows along the creek bed. They were clearly experienced in covert operations, maintaining proper spacing, communicating with subtle hand signals, and pausing at regular intervals to listen for any sign of detection. Through her spyglass, Eleanor could identify the pockmarked man from earlier leading the group, his movements betraying an eagerness that contrasted with the disciplined stealth of his companions. The intruders carried cloth-wrapped bundles that Eleanor recognized immediately as torches, along with what appeared to be containers of kerosene. Their intentions were unmistakable: set a fire large enough to destroy a significant portion of her wheat crop, but controlled enough to appear as a tragic accident rather than deliberate arson. Eleanor watched as they reached the eastern edge of her property, where the creek bed curved alongside her prized wheat field. The crop stood golden and heavy with grain, nearly ready for harvest after months of careful tending. In normal circumstances, it would have been completely vulnerable to fire, especially given the dry summer conditions. But Eleanor Sullivan's farm was no longer operating under normal circumstances. The men paused at the edge of the field, exactly where Eleanor had predicted they would establish their position. The pockmarked leader pointed 2 of his men toward the northern edge of the field, while directing the 4th, the youngest one, to remain at the creek as a lookout. Their plan was becoming clear. They would start fires at opposite ends of the field, allowing the flames to meet in the middle and destroy the entire crop. Eleanor reached for her lantern and gave another predetermined signal. 2 flashes, pause, then a third. Across the darkness, she saw an answering flash from Jenkins' position. The Blackwater men began unwrapping their torches, preparing to soak them in kerosene. The pockmarked leader struck a match, its small flame momentarily illuminating his satisfied expression. At that precise moment, a sudden rush of water surged through the modified irrigation channel Eleanor had ordered, widened days earlier. What had appeared to be a standard drainage ditch now functioned as a carefully engineered waterway, its flow controlled by a sluice gate that Jenkins had just opened in response to Eleanor's signal. Water rushed into the previously dry creek bed, reaching ankle depth in seconds. The youngest Blackwater man let out a startled curse as the water soaked his boots. The others turned in alarm, their torches still unlit, but now in danger of being rendered useless by the rising water. "What the hell?" the pockmarked leader hissed, jumping back from the expanding puddle. "Reynolds said this creek was bone dry." "It was this afternoon," one of the others muttered, hastily moving to higher ground. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The irrigation modification had been one of her first defensive preparations, simple but effective in disrupting the most obvious approach to her wheat field. Thomas had always emphasized controlling the battlefield's terrain when possible. The Blackwater men regrouped quickly, however. Professional enforcers didn't abandon their mission at the first sign of difficulty. The pockmarked leader directed his men to move farther into the field, away from the now flowing creek. "We'll work from the inside out," he ordered. "Light up!" As the men moved deeper into the wheat field, they triggered the second phase of Eleanor's defenses. The carefully rerouted irrigation had done more than just flood the creek bed. It had thoroughly soaked the first 20 feet of the field's perimeter throughout the day, rendering that section of wheat virtually fireproof. Any flames would struggle to catch hold in the dampened grain. The Blackwater men discovered this as they attempted to ignite the first sections of wheat. Their torches sputtered against the moisture-heavy stalks, producing smoke but little fire. "It's too wet," complained one of the men, frustration evident in his voice. "Someone's been watering the edges," the pockmarked leader cursed. "Move in deeper. It'll be drier toward the center." This decision played directly into Eleanor's strategy. As the men pushed farther into the wheat field, they were moving away from their escape route and into territory she had prepared specifically for intruders. Eleanor signaled again with her lantern, 3 quick flashes this time. In response, Martinez, positioned at the northern edge of the property, lit a lantern of his own and began walking along the perimeter path, his light visible above the wheat. At the same time, Dawkins emerged from his hiding place near the southern boundary, also carrying a lantern and moving with deliberate, unhurried steps. The effect on the Blackwater men was immediate. Believing themselves spotted by farm guards making routine patrols, they dropped low in the wheat, extinguishing their torches to avoid detection. "Don't move," the pockmarked leader whispered harshly. "Wait for them to pass." Eleanor tracked their position through occasional movements in the wheat. The men were now exactly where she wanted them, crouched in the center of a field that appeared to offer concealment, but actually left them exposed and disoriented. She retrieved a small metal whistle from her belt pouch, one of Thomas's old cavalry signals, and blew a single, sharp note that cut through the night air. To anyone unfamiliar with military commands, it might have sounded like a farmer signaling to dogs or workers, but Eleanor knew the Blackwater men would recognize it as a deliberate alert. The response was immediate. Martinez and Dawkins both stopped their patrol routes and turned their lanterns toward the wheat field, sweeping the beams across the area where the intruders were hiding. "They've spotted us," hissed one of the Blackwater men, panic edging into his voice. "Hold position," the leader ordered, though Eleanor could detect uncertainty creeping into his command. Eleanor blew the whistle again, this time using the pattern for converge, a standard military signal to surround a position. Sam, who had been concealed near the farmhouse, now emerged with a shotgun clearly visible in his hands. He fired once into the air, the sound echoing across the property. "That's a signal shot," the youngest Blackwater man said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "They're calling for reinforcements." The pockmarked leader hesitated, clearly reassessing the situation. What should have been a simple intimidation operation, burning part of a widow's crop to frighten her into selling, had unexpectedly encountered organized resistance. The farm that had appeared vulnerable during daylight hours was revealing unexpected defenses. Eleanor smiled grimly as she watched confusion spread among the intruders. Doubt was a powerful weapon, one that Thomas had taught her to deploy strategically, make them question their intelligence, their planning, and eventually their mission. He'd explained during one of their evening discussions about military theory. Through her spyglass, Eleanor could see the pockmarked leader gesturing for his men to retreat. They began moving back toward the creek bed, only to find that the water level had risen further. now reaching mid-calf and flowing with enough force to make crossing difficult. Jenkins, following the predetermined plan, had opened the second sluice gate, increasing the water flow to its maximum capacity. The creek bed that had provided such convenient cover for the intruders' approach now presented a significant obstacle to their escape. "Around to the gate," the leader ordered, directing his men toward the eastern entrance to the property, the same gate Eleanor had instructed Jenkins to leave conspicuously unlatched earlier. As the Blackwater men slogged through the water and mud, abandoning stealth in favor of a hasty withdrawal, Eleanor gave her final signal of the night, 4 rapid flashes that activated the last phase of this evening's defense. Sam responded by firing the shotgun twice more into the air, while Martinez and Dawkins began converging on the eastern gate, their lanterns held high. To the retreating intruders, it would appear that they were being driven into a deliberate interception. "It's a trap!" shouted one of the Blackwater men, veering away from the gate and heading instead toward the wooden fence that bordered the improperty. The group scattered, each man choosing a different escape route in their panic to avoid capture. Their coordination shattered. They crashed through underbrush and scrambled over fences, leaving behind their torches and kerosene as they fled into the darkness. Eleanor remained motionless in her blind, watching through her spyglass until she was certain all 4 intruders had left her property. Only then did she signal to her men, a long, steady light indicating that the operation had concluded successfully. As she carefully made her way back to the house through the pre-planned route, Eleanor mentally reviewed the night's events. The first test of her defenses had gone precisely as she had hoped. She had revealed enough organization and preparedness to disrupt the Blackwater Company's initial attempt at intimidation, but not enough to show her full capabilities. Hargrove would now be forced to re-evaluate his approach. He would realize that Elmwood Farm wasn't as vulnerable as it appeared, that its widow owner had unexpected resources at her disposal. This would buy Eleanor time to strengthen her position and implement the next phases of her strategy. Back in the farmhouse kitchen, Eleanor met with her men to debrief. Sam, Jenkins, Martinez, and Dawkins gathered around the table, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "We drove them off without firing a shot," Sam reported. "Just like you planned, Mrs. Sullivan." "For now," Eleanor cautioned. This was only their first attempt. She poured coffee for the men, her hands steady despite the night's tensions. "Hargrove won't give up so easily. Tonight was merely a probing action to test our defenses." "What do you think they'll report back to him?" Jenkins asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "That we were better prepared than expected. That we have some form of organized security. That the helpless widow isn't quite as helpless as she appeared." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "But they won't have realized the full extent of our preparations. To them, this will seem like a fortunate coincidence, routine irrigation work and normal night patrols that happen to disrupt their plans." "So, what happens next?" Martinez asked. "Hargrove will return tomorrow, as promised," Eleanor replied. "He'll act surprised about the unfortunate incident last night, perhaps even offer protection against unknown troublemakers in the area." Her eyes hardened. "And when I decline his offer, he'll move to his next approach, likely more direct, possibly in daylight, when they believe we'll be less prepared." "And will we be prepared, ma'am?" Dawkins asked. Eleanor's smile was small, but resolute. "More than they can possibly imagine." She unfolded a map of the property, revealing additional modifications she had planned. "Tonight was just the beginning, gentlemen. Tomorrow we will show the Blackwater Company what happens when they threaten a Sullivan farm." As the men discussed the details of the next day's preparations, Eleanor's thoughts briefly turned to Thomas. She could almost feel his approving presence as she applied the principles they had developed together over years of theoretical discussions about strategy and defensive tactics. The best defense, Thomas used to say, isn't the one that defeats your enemy outright, it's the one that makes them defeat themselves. By dawn, Eleanor Sullivan would be ready to put that principle into action against Victor Hargrove and his Blackwater Company. Morning sunlight bathed Elmwood Farm in a golden glow as Eleanor Sullivan stood on her front porch, watching dust clouds rise from the approaching riders. She had been awake since before dawn, overseeing additional preparations after the night's events. Now, dressed in a simple blue cotton dress with her hair neatly pinned beneath a practical bonnet, she presented the image of a hard-working farm widow starting her day, a stark contrast to the tactical commander who had orchestrated last night's defense. Victor Hargrove led his men toward the farmhouse at a deliberate pace. Eleanor counted 7 riders again, though she noted that the pockmarked man from yesterday was absent, likely replaced by another operative after his failure. Through her, in peripheral vision, she observed how Hargrove's eyes methodically scanned her property, reassessing what he had previously dismissed as an easy target. "Good morning, Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor called out pleasantly as the group reined to a stop before her gate. "I trust you've come for my answer regarding the railroad's offer." Hargrove dismounted with practiced grace, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Indeed, Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you've had time to consider the generous terms." Eleanor gestured toward the porch. "Would you care for some coffee while we discuss it? It's freshly brewed." A flicker of surprise crossed Hargrove's face at her hospitable tone. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "That would be most welcome." He turned to his men. "Wait here." As Hargrove followed Eleanor onto the porch, she noted how his gaze lingered on certain aspects of the farm: the newly dampened soil around the irrigation channels, the positioning of her farmhands as they went about their morning chores, the clear visibility between the house and the eastern wheat field. He was conducting a tactical assessment just as she would have done. Eleanor poured coffee into 2 china cups, her mother's best set, reserved for important visitors. "Cream or sugar, Mr. Hargrove?" "Black, thank you." He accepted the cup, studying her with renewed interest. "I must say, Mrs. Sullivan, you seem remarkably composed this morning." "And why wouldn't I be?" Eleanor asked innocently, taking a seat in her rocking chair and indicating that Hargrove should take the chair opposite. "Well," he said carefully, "there have been reports of troublemakers in the area. Several farms have experienced difficulties recently. I would hate to think Elmwood might be vulnerable to such incidents." Eleanor took a deliberate sip of her coffee before responding. "How fortunate, then, that we experienced nothing of the sort last night. Though I did notice unusual activity near the creek. My foreman tells me some strangers may have trespassed briefly before being frightened off by our night patrols." Hargrove's cup paused halfway to his lips. "Night patrols?" "Of course," Eleanor replied matter-of-factly. "Thomas, my late husband, always insisted on proper security measures, a habit from his military days that I've maintained." She smiled pleasantly. "One can't be too careful these days, especially with talk of troublemakers." The calculated look in Hargrove's eyes intensified. He set his cup down with deliberate control. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm beginning to think there's more to you than meets the eye. I'm just a farmer's widow tending to her husband's legacy, Mr. Hargrove." Eleanor's voice remained mild, but she held his gaze steadily. "Now, about that railroad offer, I've given it considerable thought, and I must decline." "That's unfortunate," Hargrove replied, his tone hardening slightly. "The Central Pacific is quite determined to secure this route. The offer on the table is their best and final one. Then we have nothing further to discuss on that matter." Eleanor remained perfectly composed. "I won't be selling Elmwood Farm, or any rights to its land. Hargrove leaned forward, his pretense of casual business dropping away. Mrs. Sullivan, perhaps I haven't made the situation clear enough. The railroad will have this land one way or another. Those who cooperate prosper. Those who resist, he let the implication hang in the air between them. Find that resistance can be costly, Eleanor finished for him. Yes, I imagine that's true. She set her coffee cup down and folded her hands in her lap. Tell me, Mr. Hargrove, how much did it cost you to replace the boots your men ruined in my creek last night? Or the torches they dropped in their haste to flee what they thought was an armed patrol? For a moment, genuine surprise registered on Hargrove's face before he masked it with a cold smile. I have no idea what you're talking about, Mrs. Sullivan, though I'm concerned that you seem to be experiencing delusions. Not delusions, Mr. Hargrove. Observations. Eleanor stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over her farm. My husband taught me to observe carefully. For instance, I observed that the young man at the end of your line, the one shifting uncomfortably in his saddle, has mud from my creek bed still caked on his boots, and the red-haired man next to him has singed his right sleeve, perhaps from a torch that burned too quickly. Hargrove remained seated, but Eleanor could feel the change in his demeanor, the reassessment happening behind those calculating eyes. You're either very observant or very lucky, Mrs. Sullivan, he said finally, rising to join her at the railing. Thomas always said luck favors the prepared. Ah, yes, Colonel Sullivan. Hargrove nodded slowly. I looked into your husband's record after our meeting yesterday. Impressive tactical mind. His defensive strategies at Antietam saved hundreds of lives. He studied her profile. What I find curious is how a wheat farm suddenly demonstrates such strategic preparedness. Eleanor turned to face him directly. Mr. Hargrove, let me be clear. I have no quarrel with the Central Pacific Railroad or its legitimate business interests. But Elmwood Farm is not for sale, not at any price, not under any circumstances, and certainly not due to intimidation tactics. Strong words from a woman alone against considerable forces, Hargrove observed, his tone conversational, but his meaning unmistakable. Am I alone, though? Eleanor asked quietly. Sheriff Hollister visited yesterday. The governor's agricultural representative comes next week. Reverend Mitchell and half the church council take tea with me every Thursday. She smiled slightly. A widow develops many meaningful connections in a community, Mr. Hargrove. People who might notice if misfortune were to befall her property. Hargrove's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You mistake business for personal animosity, Mrs. Sullivan. The railroad simply needs this land for progress. And yet your men came with torches in the night, rather than improved offers in the light of day, Eleanor countered. That suggests something other than legitimate business practices to me. A tense silence stretched between them. In the distance, Sam and the other farmhands continued their work, but Eleanor knew they were keeping the house within sight, ready to respond if needed. She had briefed them thoroughly after the night's events, ensuring they understood the next phase of her strategy. We seem to be at an impasse, Hargrove finally said, placing his hat back on his head. But impasses in business rarely last, Mrs. Sullivan. Markets change, circumstances evolve, reconsideration becomes necessary. Indeed. They do, Eleanor agreed pleasantly. And when the Central Pacific decides to route their spur line around Elmwood Farm, as several of their own surveyors recommended in their initial reports, I'll be happy to discuss fair rates for carrying my wheat on their trains. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly. You've done your research. My husband believed in being well informed. Eleanor moved toward the porch steps, a clear signal that the conversation was ending. Good day, Mr. Hargrove. Please convey my final decision to your employers. Hargrove descended the steps, but paused before mounting his horse. This isn't over, Mrs. Sullivan. The Blackwater Company always completes its contracts. I would expect Nothing less from professionals, Eleanor replied evenly, just as you should expect nothing less than a professional defense of what's mine. For a brief moment, something like respect flickered in Hargrove's eyes before being replaced by cold determination. He mounted his horse and signaled to his men. 3 days, Mrs. Sullivan, he said. I'll give you 3 days to reconsider before matters progress beyond my control. How generous, Eleanor replied, her tone revealing nothing of her thoughts. Though unnecessary, my decision stands. As Hargrove and his men rode away, Eleanor maintained her composed posture until they disappeared from view. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax slightly as she assessed what had just transpired. Sam approached from the barn, concern evident on his young face. That didn't sound good, Mrs. Sullivan. Actually, it went exactly as expected, Eleanor replied. Hargrove is a professional. He needed to confirm what happened last night and test my resolve directly, and now he'll report back, modify his strategy, and return with something more substantial than night raiders with torches. Eleanor's eyes followed the distant dust cloud of the departing riders. We have 3 days to prepare, which is 2 more than I expected. Hargrove is being cautious. He recognizes that we're not the easy target he initially assumed. What do you think they'll try next? Sam asked, falling into step beside Eleanor as she began walking toward the eastern field. Something more direct but still deniable, Eleanor analyzed. Probably damage to our equipment or infrastructure rather than crops. The irrigation pumps, perhaps, or the grain storage systems. She paused, considering. And they'll likely try to isolate us first, cut our communication with town, discourage our workers from coming in. Sam looked troubled. Mrs. Sullivan, maybe we should accept Sheriff Hollister's offer to station deputies here. Eleanor shook her head firmly. That would only escalate matters, Sam. Hargrove would see it as bringing in authorities, which would justify more extreme measures on his part. She gazed across her property thoughtfully. Besides, official involvement complicates the narrative. Right now, we're simply a farm declining to sell. If the sheriff gets involved, suddenly it's about law enforcement against business interests, a much more complex political situation that the railroad could manipulate. So what do? We continue with our preparations. Eleanor's voice took on the clear, decisive tone she used when fully engaged in strategic planning. Have Jenkins reinforce the bridge over the North Stream, make it look like routine maintenance, but ensure it can support the weight of the water wagon if needed. Martinez should accelerate the movement of essential equipment to our secondary barn, and I want the defensive modifications to the main house completed by nightfall. Yes, ma'am. Sam nodded, impressed as always by her foresight. As they reached the eastern wheat field, Eleanor surveyed the golden expanse thoughtfully. Last night's attempted arson had confirmed her assessment of Hargrove's initial strategy. The coming days would test whether she had correctly anticipated his next moves as well. Thomas always said that the first rule of strategic defense is to make your opponent question his own intelligence, Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. Hargrove came here believing he faced a simple widow with a valuable farm. Now he's not certain what he's facing, and that uncertainty will shape his next actions. She turned to Sam, her expression resolute. Send word to Sheriff Hollister, not asking for deputies, but informing him that we've had trespassers and are taking appropriate security measures. That creates an official record without requesting intervention. And if Hargrove escalates, before the 3 days are up? Sam asked. Eleanor's hand unconsciously touched the locket containing Thomas's portrait. Then we'll be ready to show him exactly what he's really facing. A Sullivan farm defended by Sullivan tactics. As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor's mind was already mapping out the next phases of her defense. Hargrove had promised to return in 3 days, but she suspected he would test her defenses again before then, perhaps as soon as tonight. The first confrontation had established the battlefield. Now the true campaign would begin, and Eleanor Sullivan intended to control every aspect of it. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over Oakridge Valley, promising rain that would normally be welcomed by farmers in the summer heat. Eleanor Sullivan watched the sky from the doorway of her barn, calculating how the changing weather might affect both her operations and Hargrove's plans. "Rain works in our favor," she told Jenkins as they inspected the reinforced doors on the equipment shed. "It will make nighttime movement more difficult and dampen any further attempts at arson. But it'll soften the ground," Jenkins pointed out. "Easier for horses to move quietly if they avoid the gravel paths." Eleanor nodded, pleased with his tactical thinking. "Precisely why I want those trip lines installed along the southern approach before dusk. They won't be looking for obstacles there." As predicted, Eleanor's farm had been effectively cut off from town by mid-morning. 2 of her regular farmhands had been stopped on the road by concerned citizens who warned them that working at Elmwood might be dangerous given recent troubles in the valley. The grain merchant who usually collected her weekly shipment sent a boy with a note, explaining that his wagon had broken down, a transparent excuse that Eleanor had anticipated. "They're isolating us," she explained to Sam and her core team over lunch. "Standard procedure before escalating pressure. They want to demonstrate that we're vulnerable and alone." "What's our counter?" Martinez asked, having embraced his role in Eleanor's defensive strategy with increasing confidence. Eleanor spread a map of the property across the kitchen table. "They expect us to panic, to concentrate our diminished forces around the house and main barn. Instead, we'll maintain our perimeter as planned, using our predetermined fallback positions and signal system." She pointed to specific locations. "They'll be watching for conventional defensive arrangements. Armed men at obvious choke points. We'll give them something different." Throughout the afternoon, Eleanor's farm workers made highly visible preparations that appeared to match what Hargrove would expect, boarding up ground floor windows, moving valuable equipment into the main barn, posting obvious lookouts at the farm's main entrance. But these activities were largely for show. The real preparations happened more discreetly, ammunition and supplies distributed to concealed positions throughout the property, defensive obstacles placed along likely approach routes, alternative communication methods established to replace their compromised regular channels. As evening approached, Eleanor called Sam and Jenkins to her study. "I received a message from Sheriff Hollister," she informed them, holding up a folded note. "One of the Blackwater men was in town this afternoon asking questions about our defenses and spreading rumors about my mental state, suggesting that grief has made me unstable and dangerous." "That's outrageous," Sam protested. "It's actually predictable," Eleanor replied calmly. "They're establishing a narrative to justify whatever happens next. If I'm viewed as unstable, then any incident can be framed as my own fault." She refolded the note carefully. More importantly, they were asking specific questions about how many men stayed on the property overnight and whether we had firearms. Jenkins frowned. "They're planning another night operation." "Yes, but not like the first," Eleanor assessed. "Hargrove isn't one to repeat failed tactics. This will be something different, probably targeting our infrastructure rather than crops." As darkness fell, rain began to patter against the roof, gradually intensifying into a steady downpour. Eleanor moved through her evening routine as usual, making sure the house lights followed the same pattern an observer would have noted on previous nights. But instead of retiring to her bedroom, she made her way to the modified root cellar that now served as her tactical headquarters. The underground room had been transformed with maps of the property pinned to the walls, communication equipment arranged on a central table, and supplies organized in military precision. Thomas would have approved of the setup, a command center that allowed Eleanor to monitor and direct operations while remaining protected. "Movement at the South Bridge," came Martinez's hushed report through the speaking tube Eleanor had installed years earlier to communicate with the outlying buildings. Originally designed to allow her to check on sick animals during storms without leaving the house, the network of tubes now served a more strategic purpose. "How many?" Eleanor asked, marking the location on her map. "3 riders, moving carefully." A pause. "They're carrying something bulky on the pack horse." Eleanor's mind quickly analyzed the possibilities. The South Bridge provided access across the stream that bordered her property, a necessary route for moving farm equipment, but also a potential vulnerability. Anything bulky would likely be supplied for a more substantial operation than the previous night's attempted arson. "Maintain position, but don't engage," she instructed. "I want to see what they're planning before we respond." Over the next hour, reports came in of additional movement around the farm's perimeter. Eleanor tracked each sighting on her map, gradually assembling a complete picture of Hargrove's operation. Unlike the previous night's 4-man team, this appeared to be a coordinated effort involving at least 10 men divided into 3 groups. "They're establishing positions around the water pump station," Dawkins reported from his concealed post. "Near the western field." The pieces clicked into place in Eleanor's mind. "They're going to sabotage our irrigation system," she concluded. "Without water, the remaining crops would wither within days in this heat." It was a clever escalation, less dramatic than arson, but potentially more devastating to a farm's long-term viability. The damage would appear possibly accidental, difficult to prove as deliberate sabotage, yet would demonstrate to Eleanor the futility of resistance. "What's our move, Mrs. Sullivan?" Sam asked through the speaking tube from his position in the barn loft, which offered a commanding view of the central property. Eleanor studied her map, mentally reviewing the defensive preparations they had made earlier. "Let them approach the pump station," she decided. "But I want eyes on whatever they're planning to do to it. Jenkins, can you get closer without being detected?" "Already moving, ma'am," came the whispered reply. "The drainage culvert gives me cover to within 30 feet." For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor tracked the movements of Hargrove's men through her network of observers. The rain continued steadily, reducing visibility but also masking the sounds of movement across the property. Through the speaking tubes, she constructed a clear picture of an operation designed to cripple her farm's water supply while creating minimal evidence of deliberate sabotage. "They're unpacking something at the pump station," Jenkins reported, his voice barely audible over the sound of rainfall against the speaking tube. "Looks like mechanical parts and tools. They're going to replace components inside the pump." Eleanor's mind raced ahead. If they replaced critical parts of the pump mechanism with defective components, the system would fail within days, appearing to be a natural breakdown rather than sabotage. By the time she could get replacement parts from the nearest supply town, her crops would be dying in the fields. "I see Hargrove," came Sam's sudden report. "He's observing from the ridge near the oak grove, not participating directly." Of course, Eleanor thought. Hargrove would oversee but maintain personal distance from any action that might later be questioned. A professional approach. "Jenkins, can you identify what they're replacing?" Eleanor asked. "Looks like the main drive coupling and the pressure valve assembly," Jenkins replied after a moment. "Standard parts, but if they're using sabotaged replacements, they'll fail when under full operating pressure tomorrow," Eleanor finished for him. She had anticipated something like this, though not the specific target. Her mind quickly adjusted, her strategy accordingly. "Sam, are they watching the house?" "2 men positioned with clear sight lines to your bedroom window," Sam confirmed. Eleanor nodded to herself. Hargrove would want confirmation that she remained unaware of the operation. The light in her bedroom, where pillows arranged under blankets created the silhouette of a sleeping figure, would reassure them that their activity remained undetected. "Here's what we're going to do," Eleanor decided, her tactical mind formulating a response that would leverage Hargrove's expectations against him. "Jenkins, do not interfere with their work at the pump station. Let them complete the sabotage." "Ma'am?" Jenkins sounded confused. "Trust me," Eleanor assured him. "I want them to believe they've succeeded. Meanwhile, Martinez and Dawkins should create a minor disturbance at the North Barn, something that sounds like an accident, not an alert." Her plan crystallized as she spoke. "We'll draw their attention briefly to the north side while Sam retrieves the original pump components after they leave. They'll think their operation was completely successful while we'll actually be one step ahead." "And tomorrow?" Sam asked. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice, "we give Mr. Hargrove exactly what he expects to see, but not what he expects to get." The plan was executed with precision. Martinez and Dawkins created a convincing distraction, a toppled stack of empty barrels that crashed loudly enough to draw attention, but appeared accidental enough not to raise alarms. As predicted, Hargrove's men completed their sabotage of the pump station and withdrew, convinced their mission had been accomplished without detection. Once they were clear of the property, Sam recovered the original pump components that had been removed and hidden by the saboteurs. As Eleanor had anticipated, the replacement parts looked identical but had been subtly modified to fail catastrophically when under pressure. "Clever work," she acknowledged, examining the sabotaged parts in the root cellar headquarters later. That night, professional quality, these would have destroyed the entire pump assembly when they failed, requiring complete replacement, which would take weeks to acquire and install, Sam noted, understanding the strategy now. By then I would be desperate to sell," Eleanor confirmed. "Crops dying in the fields, no way to irrigate, repair costs mounting." She set the sabotage components aside carefully. "Hargrove is escalating according to a clear pattern, each step designed to appear possibly accidental while systematically undermining my ability to maintain the farm." "So what happens tomorrow?" Jenkins asked. Eleanor's expression was resolute. "Tomorrow, we allow the sabotage to appear successful, but in a way that serves our purposes rather than Hargrove's." She gestured to the farm's water distribution map on the wall. "We'll install the original components, but adjust the system to create a visible but limited failure that I can dramatically discover when I inspect the fields." "You want Hargrove to think his plan worked?" Martinez asked, confused. "I want Hargrove to think his plan worked exactly as intended," Eleanor clarified. "When he sees me distressed, inspecting damaged crops, calling for repairs, he'll believe his strategy is proceeding perfectly. He'll report success to his employers, who will likely authorize him to proceed to the next phase of pressure." "Which will be?" Sam looked concerned. "Something more direct," Eleanor predicted. "The pattern suggests they'll move from property damage to personal intimidation, but they'll only do that if they believe the indirect methods are working as planned." Her eyes reflected the lamplight with determined intensity. "And that's when we'll have the advantage, because they'll be following their playbook while we're already several moves ahead." As her men dispersed to their quarters for a few hours of rest before dawn, Eleanor remained in the command center, studying the sabotaged pump components with professional appreciation. Hargrove's technical knowledge was impressive. The modifications would have been virtually undetectable to anyone without specialized mechanical training. "You'd have admired the craftsmanship, Thomas," she murmured, running her finger along a precisely weakened joint designed to rupture under pressure. "They're good at what they do." She turned to her husband's portrait on the small table beside her map. "But they still think they're fighting a grieving widow, not someone who helped plan the defense of Antietam." By dawn, Eleanor had finalized Her counter-strategy. The Blackwater Company had introduced deception into their campaign against her farm. Now she would show them what true deception looked like in the hands of a master strategist. The morning broke clear after the night's rain, steam rising from the dampened fields as the summer sun began to warm the land. Eleanor Sullivan emerged from her farmhouse at dawn, her face set in a mask of composure that revealed nothing of the night's events or her current strategy. To any observer, and she was certain Hargrove had men watching, she appeared to be conducting her normal morning inspection of the property. Remember, she had instructed her core team over a pre-dawn breakfast, today we perform for an audience. Every action, every word must support the narrative we want Hargrove to believe. On schedule, Eleanor made her way to the eastern fields, where the irrigation channels delivered water from the pump station. Sam accompanied her, carrying tools as if prepared for routine maintenance. They moved with the unhurried confidence of farmers who expected a normal day's work. At precisely 8 o'clock, Jenkins activated the modified pump system they had prepared during the early morning hours. As planned, water surged through the irrigation channels for approximately 3 minutes before a loud, metallic groaning emanated from the pump station, followed by a spectacular but carefully controlled spray of water from a deliberately weakened joint. "The pump!" Eleanor cried, her voice pitched to carry to any listening ears. She broke into a convincing imitation of panicked running toward the station, Sam following close behind. The performance that followed would have impressed any theater crowd. Eleanor, her dress soaking as she waded into the spray, called urgent instructions to Sam and Martinez, who made a show of attempting emergency repairs. The water flow to the eastern fields visibly diminished, then stopped completely, leaving the irrigation channels dry under the strengthening sun. "It's the main coupling," Eleanor declared loudly, examining the pump with apparent distress. "Completely sheared. We need replacement parts from Miller's Crossing immediately." She turned to Sam with convincing desperation. "If we don't get water to the eastern fields by tomorrow, we'll lose at least 30% of the crop." Sam nodded gravely, playing his part perfectly. "I'll ride for Miller's Crossing right away, Mrs. Sullivan." "No," Eleanor countered, injecting uncertainty into her voice. "The roads, there have been reports of trouble. We can't risk our only able-bodied men." She paced with apparent anxiety. "I'll go myself. You and the others need to stay and try to salvage what you can." This exchange, staged where it could be easily overheard, established several key elements of the narrative Eleanor wanted to convey. The pump failure was catastrophic, replacement parts would be difficult to acquire, and most importantly, she would be leaving the farm, while most of her workers focused on the eastern fields. As Eleanor drove her wagon toward town an hour later, dressed in her best visiting clothes, she permitted herself a small smile of satisfaction. Through her rear view, she could see a rider breaking away from the tree line to report her departure, exactly as she had predicted. What Hargrove couldn't know was that Eleanor had no intention of reaching Miller's Crossing. A quarter-mile down the road, concealed by a bend and a stand of cottonwoods, Jenkins waited with the actual replacement parts they had salvaged the previous night. After a brief exchange, Eleanor turned her wagon onto a rarely used logging track that curved through the woods and would eventually bring her back to Elmwood Farm through the rarely monitored northern boundary. Meanwhile, Sam and Martinez maintained their visible efforts at the damaged pump station, ensuring that any observers would report that the farm's water system remained crippled, and the majority of workers were occupied with emergency measures in the eastern section. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor had returned to Elmwood undetected, entering through the hidden northern access point and making her way to the concealed root cellar command center via the underground tunnel from the equipment shed. There, Dawkins was monitoring reports from their observation posts scattered throughout the property. "Any unusual movement?" Eleanor asked, removing her bonnet and replacing it with a more practical hat. "Just as you predicted, ma'am." Dawkins confirmed. "Hargrove sent 2 men to follow you toward Miller's Crossing. They haven't returned yet. Meanwhile, we've spotted 3 riders conducting close reconnaissance of the property, focusing particularly on the southern approach and the main house." Eleanor nodded, mentally updating her assessment of Hargrove's strategy. "They're planning to move tonight," she concluded. "With me supposedly absent and the men focused on the crop crisis, they'll see an opportunity for a more direct approach." "What kind of approach?" Dawkins asked. "Personal intimidation," Eleanor replied, her voice matter of fact. "Possibly a home invasion scenario. Enter the house at night, create enough fear to convince me that continuing to resist is dangerous to my personal safety." She had seen this pattern before in disputes over land and water rights during the early days of her marriage to Thomas. Throughout the afternoon, Eleanor finalized preparations for the evening's confrontation. The farm maintained its appearance of crisis response, men working frantically at the pump station, others trying to salvage crops, and the house seemingly less guarded than usual. Meanwhile, her actual defensive positions were strengthened and disguised with even greater care. "We've been reactive thus far," Eleanor told her team as dusk approached. "Tonight, we seize the initiative." As darkness fell, Eleanor positioned herself in the parlor of the main house, clearly visible through the windows as she sat at her writing desk, apparently working on correspondence by lamplight. The scene projected vulnerability. A woman alone, in a large house, her attention focused on papers rather than potential threats. In reality, the parlor had been subtly modified for defensive purposes. Furniture had been rearranged to create clear firing lanes while providing cover. The heavy oak desk where Eleanor sat was reinforced with metal plating on the side facing the windows. Most importantly, hidden alarm triggers had been installed at every potential entry point. Eleanor worked steadily on actual correspondence, her calm exterior masking heightened awareness of every sound from outside. Thomas had taught her that genuine activities produced more convincing performances than pretense alone. "Don't act busy," he'd advised during a potential border raid years ago. "Be busy, but remain alert." At precisely 10 o'clock, Eleanor folded her letters, sealed them with wax, and moved to the kitchen as if preparing evening tea. This position gave her a clear view of the rear approaches to the house while maintaining the appearance of routine domestic activities. The first indication of movement came from a subtle vibration in the floorboards, a warning system Jenkins had installed that morning. Someone was approaching across the back porch, trying to remain silent, but unaware that the boards had been deliberately loosened to detect even the lightest footsteps. Eleanor continued preparing her tea, showing no reaction even, as she mentally counted the distinct vibration patterns. 3 men, moving with professional caution, attempted to use the kitchen door, exactly as she had anticipated. Hargrove would choose the kitchen rather than more obvious entries, knowing that servant entrances were typically less secured in rural homes. She allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Hargrove was following the standard playbook for intimidation operations. Wait until late evening, approach from the least visible angle, enter through service entrances, and surprise the target in what should be their most vulnerable location. What he couldn't know was that Eleanor had helped Thomas develop countermeasures to precisely these tactics when advising military families on home defense during border tensions. As the kitchen door latch began to move, Eleanor casually reached for the teapot on the stove, her movements unhurried even as her senses registered every detail of the intruder's approach. The door opened with barely a sound, evidence of professional skill, and 3 shadows slipped into the dimly lit kitchen. Eleanor turned, teapot in hand, and let out a perfectly calibrated gasp of surprise. The lead intruder, the same pockmarked man from before, stepped forward with a revolver held low. "Evening, Mrs. Sullivan," he said with mock courtesy. "Sorry to disturb your tea." Eleanor clutched at her collar in an excellent mimicry of feminine distress. What is the meaning of this? Who are you men?" "Just some concerned citizens," the pockmarked man replied, his companions spreading out to flank her. All three wore dark clothing and had bandanas pulled up to conceal their faces, though Eleanor had already identified them from their builds and movements. "We heard you were having troubles with your farm and thought we'd offer some personal advice about your situation." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice deliberately unsteady. "If you wanted to speak with me, you could have called during daylight hours." The pockmarked man smiled coldly. "Some conversations are best had in private, ma'am. Now, why don't we move to your parlor, where we can discuss your reconsideration of the railroad's offer in comfort?" Eleanor allowed herself to be herded toward the parlor, maintaining the appearance of frightened confusion. As they passed through the doorway, she stumbled slightly, catching herself against the doorframe, and in doing so, pressed the concealed trigger that activated her signal system. In the barn loft, a small bell rang once, alerting Sam to initiate the response they had prepared. Similar signals reached Jenkins and Martinez at their positions. The intruders arranged themselves in the parlor with practiced efficiency, one by the window as lookout, one blocking the exit, and the pockmarked leader positioning himself before Eleanor as she sank into a chair, seemingly overwhelmed by this invasion. "Now, Mrs. Sullivan," the leader began, his tone conversational, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of threat, "we understand you've had some unfortunate equipment failures today. Very bad timing, what with the summer heat threatening your crops." "How did you know about that?" Eleanor asked, injecting a note of suspicion into her performance. The man shrugged. "Word travels. The point is, these sorts of accidents tend to multiply when people make unwise business decisions." He leaned closer. "The railroad's offer is more than fair, certainly better than watching your husband's legacy wither in the fields while you struggle with mounting repair costs." Eleanor clutched her handkerchief, playing the role of a frightened widow being pushed to her breaking point. "Is that a threat, sir?" "Let's call it a prediction," he replied. "One bad pump today. Tomorrow, perhaps your well runs dry. The next day, maybe your barn has structural issues." His voice hardened. "Farming is a dangerous business, Mrs. Sullivan. Accidents happen. People get hurt." Outside, the faint sound of an owl's call, actually Sam's signal that he was in position, carried through the open window. Eleanor recognized it immediately but gave no sign, instead allowing her expression to shift from fear to outrage. "So you're here to threaten an unprotected woman," she said, her voice gaining strength. "To frighten me into selling my husband's farm against my better judgment." The man seemed pleased by her accurate assessment. "I prefer to think of it as helping you see reason before circumstances become truly unfortunate." He gestured to his companion by the window. "Johnson served as a medic during the war. He's seen how quickly accidents around a farm can turn deadly. Haven't you, Johnson?" The man by the window nodded slowly, his eyes cold. Eleanor rose from her chair, drawing herself up with dignity. The three men tensed slightly, unprepared for this change in demeanor. "I think I understand perfectly now," she said, her voice suddenly steady and clear. "You gentlemen work for Victor Hargrove and the Blackwater Company. You're here because your previous attempts to intimidate me have failed, so you're escalating to direct threats." The pockmarked man's expression flickered with surprise before hardening. "You're more informed than we expected, Mrs. Sullivan, but it doesn't change your situation." "Oh, but it does," Eleanor replied calmly. She moved toward her writing desk with measured steps. "You see, you're operating under several critical misconceptions about me and this farm. Ma'am, I wouldn't The man started, raising his revolver. Slightly. First misconception, Eleanor continued, ignoring the implied threat as she reached her desk, that I am alone and unprotected. She opened the desk drawer with deliberate movements. The pockmarked man stepped forward threateningly. That's far enough, Mrs. Sullivan. Eleanor withdrew not a weapon, but a small brass whistle, Thomas's old cavalry signal whistle. Before any of the intruders could react, she blew a sharp, precise pattern of notes that cut through the night air. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The parlor windows suddenly illuminated with light from multiple lanterns positioned outside, casting the intruders in stark relief. Simultaneously, the unmistakable sound of shotguns being cocked came from both the front porch and the kitchen. A doorway. Second misconception, Eleanor continued calmly, setting the whistle down on the desk, that my husband only taught me how to run a farm. The three intruders froze, suddenly aware they were completely exposed and targeted from multiple angles. Through the windows, they could see the silhouettes of armed men, positioned strategically around the house. What is this? The pockmarked man demanded, his confidence crumbling. This, Eleanor replied, moving with newfound authority to the center of the room, is a defensive perimeter established according to United States Army field protocols developed at West Point. She smiled slightly at their confusion. My husband was quite thorough in sharing his military knowledge. Sam's voice called clearly from outside. Mrs. Sullivan? Your orders, ma'am? The three intruders exchanged alarmed glances, their plan for simple intimidation having collapsed completely. Hold positions, Mr. Tucker, Eleanor responded with the calm, command presence of a military officer. Our visitors were just leaving through the front door, where Sheriff Hollister can properly identify them. Hollister isn't here, the pockmarked man challenged, though with noticeably less conviction. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? Because I sent him a detailed letter this morning outlining the Blackwater Company's activities on my property, including the sabotage of my irrigation system. She gestured to the front window, where a lantern was indeed approaching from the road. That appears to be his wagon now. In fact, it was Martinez driving a farm wagon with specific lantern placement designed to mimic the sheriff's usual approach. Another element of Eleanor's carefully choreographed response. The pockmarked man's expression shifted from confidence to calculation to reluctant resignation. This isn't over, Mrs. Sullivan, he said quietly. You've shown your hand now. Hargrove will respond accordingly. I'm counting on it, Eleanor replied with unexpected confidence. Please convey to Mr. Hargrove that his tactical assessment of Elmwood Farm has been woefully inadequate. Colonel Sullivan didn't just teach me farming, he taught me warfare. The intruders were escorted out at gunpoint by Sam and Jenkins. Eleanor maintained her commanding presence. Only when they had been securely removed from the property did she permit herself to sink into the nearest chair, the accumulated tension of the evening's performance finally showing in her expression. Well played, ma'am, Dawkins said admiringly, as he secured the house. They never suspected a thing until it was too late. It's only the beginning, Eleanor cautioned, accepting the cup of actual tea he offered. Tonight, we revealed more of our capabilities than I would have preferred, but it was necessary to establish clear boundaries. She stared thoughtfully into the fire. Hargrove will escalate further now. His professional pride has been challenged. Let him come, Sam declared, returning from seeing the intruders off the property. We're ready. Eleanor shook her head slightly. No, Sam. Until tonight, we were facing predictable tactics from the Blackwater Company's standard approach. Now Hargrove will recognize that he's dealing with something unexpected. He'll adapt, innovate. She rose and moved to the map of the property she kept in her study. We must anticipate a much more sophisticated response. As her team gathered around to discuss the night's events and prepare for what would come next, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of concern and satisfaction. The direct confrontation had been necessary, a demonstration that Elmwood Farm was not defenseless against intimidation tactics. But it had also transformed the nature of the conflict. Thomas always said that the most dangerous moment in any campaign is when you force your opponent to abandon their standard strategy, she murmured, tracing the boundaries of her property on the map. Because then they start thinking creatively. In The Darkness Beyond Elmwood Farm, Victor Hargrove received the report of his men's failure with cold fury. The widow Sullivan was clearly not what she appeared to be, and the campaign to acquire her land would now require methods beyond his usual approach. The battlefield had been defined, the opening moves had been made, and Eleanor Sullivan had just demonstrated that she was a far more formidable opponent than anyone had anticipated. The golden light of dawn was just breaking over the eastern hills when Sheriff William Hollister's wagon rolled up to Elmwood Farm. Eleanor Sullivan, who had been awake for hours reviewing defensive positions with Jenkins, met him on the front porch with a pot of fresh coffee. "You look like you haven't slept," Hollister observed, accepting the cup she offered. His weathered face showed concern. Beneath his official composure, "Sleep is a luxury during a siege, William," Eleanor replied with a tired smile. "Thomas taught me that." The sheriff nodded gravely. "I received your message about last night's intrusion. 3 men, armed, threatening you in your own home." He shook his head disapprovingly. "That crosses a line, Eleanor, even for the Blackwater Company. I've sent telegrams to the federal marshal's office requesting assistance." Eleanor studied her old friend's face. "But you don't expect them to respond quickly, do you?" Hollister sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "That's what I came to tell you in person. There's complications, political considerations." "The railroad," Eleanor surmised, unsurprised. She gestured for the sheriff to follow her into the house. At the kitchen table, she spread out several documents she had been reviewing. "The Central Pacific has considerable influence with territorial officials. I anticipated they might delay any official response." Hollister examined the papers, land surveys, property records, and a map of the proposed railroad spur line. "You've done your research," he noted with approval. "Know your enemy's objectives," Eleanor quoted. Thomas insisted that understanding motivation was as important as understanding tactics. She tapped a section of the map where the railroad's planned route cut directly through Elmwood Farm. "This isn't just about my land, William. The Central Pacific wants to establish a divisional headquarters here, a major depot that would essentially control commerce throughout the valley." "How did you discover this?" Hollister asked, impressed. "These plans aren't public knowledge." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I have friends in the Territorial Surveyor's office, and people tend to speak freely around a widow they assume is only concerned with household matters." She highlighted a section of the documents showing projected development plans. "If the railroad succeeds, they won't just control transportation through Oak Ridge Valley. They'll control water rights, access roads, and eventually the region's entire economy. My farm stands in the way of more than just tracks." Hollister's expression darkened as he grasped the full implications. "That explains why they've been so persistent and why Hargrove was brought in." He met Eleanor's eyes directly. "This isn't just about intimidating one stubborn widow anymore. You're facing a corporate empire with virtually unlimited resources." "I expected as much," Eleanor acknowledged calmly. "Which is why I've been preparing for a prolonged conflict rather than just repelling individual attacks." Before Hollister could respond, Sam hurried into the kitchen, his expression urgent. "Mrs. Sullivan, riders approaching from the South Road, at least a dozen moving fast." Eleanor and Hollister moved quickly to the front porch. Through her spyglass, Eleanor counted 14 mounted men approaching in formation, with Victor Hargrove and another well-dressed man leading the column. "That's Edward Simmons beside Hargrove," Hollister said grimly, recognizing the second leader. "Central Pacific's regional director. This has become official company business now." "Good," Eleanor replied with unexpected confidence. "I prefer dealing with the organ grinder rather than the monkey." As the riders approached the farm's main gate, Eleanor assessed their composition with a tactician's eye. Unlike the covert teams Hargrove had previously deployed, this group made no attempt to hide their purpose or affiliation. Several wore the distinctive dark blue uniforms of the Blackwater Company, openly armed with rifles and sidearms. Others were dressed as railroad company men, carrying surveying equipment and legal portfolios. "They're changing tactics," Eleanor observed. "No more night raids or sabotage. They're moving to assert official authority." "Eleanor," Hollister warned quietly, "I'm only one man with a badge. Against that many, I can't—" "I'm not asking you to start a firefight, William," she interrupted gently. "But your presence as a witness to whatever happens next will be invaluable." The sheriff nodded, straightening his posture and adjusting his badge so it was clearly visible as the riders halted at the gate. Hargrove and Simmons dismounted and approached the house, leaving their men waiting in disciplined formation. Eleanor noted the change in Hargrove's demeanor. Gone was the false courtesy of their previous encounters, replaced by cold, professional determination. His previous estimation of her had clearly been revised. "Mrs. Sullivan," Simmons called out, a portly man in an expensive suit that seemed ill-suited to the dusty surroundings. "I'm Edward Simmons, Regional Director for the Central Pacific Railroad. I believe we have matters of significant importance to discuss." "Indeed we do, Mr. Simmons," Eleanor replied from the porch, her voice carrying clearly. "Beginning with your company's employment of armed men to threaten me in my home last night." Simmons barely blinked at the accusation. "I understand there may have been some overzealous actions by local contractors concerned about your welfare, given your isolation and the recent troubles in the valley." "Contractors?" Sheriff Hollister interjected. "Is that what you're calling the Blackwater Company these days?" Hargrove stepped forward, his scarred face impassive. "Sheriff Hollister, your presence is noted, though not strictly necessary, for what is essentially a business negotiation." "A negotiation typically doesn't involve 14 armed men, Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor observed dryly. "Precautionary measures only, I assure you," Simmons said with practiced smoothness. "Given reports of armed guards and military-style defenses on your property, we felt it prudent to ensure adequate security for our discussions." Eleanor caught the underlying message immediately. Hargrove had reported her defensive capabilities, and the railroad was adjusting its approach accordingly. "No more underestimation." "I see," she replied. "Well, as you've come officially and in daylight, perhaps you'd like to join me for coffee while we discuss your company's interest in my property. Though I'm afraid I can only accommodate you and—" "Mr. Hargrove on the porch, your men will need to remain at the gate." A brief look of annoyance crossed Simmons' face before he masked it with a businessman's smile. "That would be acceptable, Mrs. Sullivan, though I must insist that at least 2 of our security personnel accompany us, given recent misunderstandings." Eleanor nodded her assent, recognizing the negotiation within the negotiation. As Simmons signaled 2 Blackwater men forward, she caught Sam's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He slipped away to alert the rest of her team according to their predetermined protocols. The meeting on Eleanor's porch had the superficial appearance of a civilized business discussion. Coffee was served, pleasantries exchanged, and documents spread across a small table. But the underlying tension was unmistakable. Armed men stood at attention nearby, and Sheriff Hollister maintained a vigilant presence at Eleanor's side. "Mrs. Sullivan," Simmons began. "Once the formalities had been observed, the Central Pacific Railroad is prepared to increase its offer for your property by 20% above our previous terms. This represents an extraordinarily generous valuation, particularly in light of your farm's recent mechanical difficulties." Eleanor sipped her coffee calmly. "How interesting that you're aware of our pump failure, Mr. Simmons. News certainly travels quickly in Oak Ridge Valley." Simmons waved away the implication. "The region's agricultural health is naturally of concern to major businesses considering investment, but that's hardly relevant to the matter at hand." He slid a document toward her. "This revised offer includes provisions for you to maintain residence in the main house for up to 1 year during transition and a generous pension thereafter." "That's very thoughtful," Eleanor replied, making no move to take the document. "However, I remain uninterested in selling Elmwood Farm at any price." Hargrove, who had been silently observing, leaned forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, perhaps we should speak plainly. Your position is ultimately untenable. The territorial governor has already approved the railroad's right-of-way through this valley. Eminent domain proceedings are being prepared as we speak." "On what grounds?" Sheriff Hollister demanded. "Public necessity," Simmons replied smoothly. "The economic development of the territory requires modern transportation infrastructure. Individual interests, however sentimental, cannot be allowed to impede progress." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this argument. "I'm familiar with eminent domain law, Mr. Simmons. It requires fair market compensation and, more importantly, proof that the specific route is necessary rather than merely convenient." She unfolded her own map of the region. "According to the Territorial Surveyor's original recommendations, the optimal route for your spur line actually runs 3 miles east of my property, requiring fewer bridges and grading adjustments." Simmons' confident expression faltered slightly. "Those preliminary surveys were superseded by more recent assessments. Assessments conducted by surveyors directly employed by Central Pacific," Eleanor countered, "after you had already begun acquiring properties along this route, including the Dawson and Miller farms, purchased at distressed prices following mysterious accidents." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, reassessing Eleanor yet again. She wasn't just defending her farm, she was demonstrating comprehensive knowledge of the railroad's entire regional strategy. "Mrs. Sullivan," Simmons said, his tone hardening, "you seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that you have options. Here, the railroad will have this land one way or another. The only variable is whether you benefit financially from the inevitable." "Is that a threat, Mr. Simmons?" Sheriff Hollister asked quietly. "Simply economic reality, Sheriff," Simmons replied. "Progress cannot be held hostage to individual obstinacy." Eleanor set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Gentlemen, I think we've reached the portion of our discussion where pretense becomes unnecessary, so let me be equally plain. I am aware of your company's actual intentions for my property, not merely a railroad spur, but a divisional headquarters and commercial hub that would effectively control the entire valley's economy." The surprised look exchanged between Simmons and Hargrove confirmed her assertion. "Furthermore," she continued calmly, "I'm aware that the Central Pacific has already sold development options to associated businesses contingent on controlling the water rights that come with Elmwood Farm, rights that are far more valuable than the land itself." "You're remarkably well informed for a widow managing a wheat farm," Hargrove observed, his tone a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "My husband believed that information was as valuable as ammunition," Eleanor replied. "A principle I've maintained since his passing." Simmons abandoned his businesslike demeanor, his face flushing with anger. "This is becoming tiresome, Mrs. Sullivan. Your property will be acquired, legally through purchase, officially through eminent domain, or practically through economic necessity when your farm operations become untenable due to unfortunate circumstances. The choice is yours, but the outcome is not in question. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Mr. Simmons, I don't believe you understand the situation fully. You see, I've taken certain precautionary measures of my own. Your amateur defensive preparations, Hargrove scoffed. Impressive for a local dispute, perhaps, but hardly relevant against the resources at our disposal. I wasn't referring to my defensive measures, Mr. Hargrove, Eleanor clarified. I was referring to the documentation I've compiled regarding the Central Pacific's activities in Oak Ridge Valley, including witness statements about intimidation tactics, evidence of sabotage, and records of artificially depressed property and purchases. She smiled slightly, copies of which have been placed with my attorneys in Sacramento, the territorial governor's office, and several newspaper editors, with instructions for release should anything, unfortunately, happen to me or my property. The silence that followed was profound. Simmons stared at Eleanor with undisguised shock, while Hargrove's expression shifted to one of calculating reassessment. You're bluffing, Simmons finally managed. A widow learns to take precautions, Mr. Simmons, Eleanor replied evenly. Especially one who has observed systematic efforts to undermine neighboring properties. The Dawsons and Millers may have sold under duress, but they were quite willing to provide sworn statements afterwards, once they understood they weren't alone in experiencing accidents. Hargrove set his coffee cup down and studied Eleanor with new appreciation. You've been building a legal case while we thought you were merely defending your farm. I've been doing both, Mr. Hargrove, Eleanor corrected. My husband taught me that a proper defense operates on multiple fronts simultaneously. Sheriff Hollister, who had been silently observing the exchange, shifted his coat to ensure his sidearm was visible, a subtle reminder of official law enforcement presence. Simmons, his face now flushed with barely controlled rage, gathered his documents. This discussion is clearly unproductive at present. The Central Pacific will pursue its legal options through appropriate channels. Of course, Eleanor agreed pleasantly, and I'll continue to pursue mine. As Simmons rose to leave, Eleanor addressed Hargrove directly. Mr. Hargrove, a professional observation, if I may. Your tactical assessment of this farm and its owner was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Had you conducted proper reconnaissance, you might have learned that Colonel Sullivan's wife was more than a decorative companion during his military career. Hargrove's expression remained controlled, but a flicker of genuine curiosity crossed his features. Enlighten me, Mrs. Sullivan. The colonel credited me with developing the defensive strategy that protected the Union's supply lines at Antietam, Eleanor said simply. Though officially, of course, such contributions remain unacknowledged, much like your company's actual objectives in Oak Ridge Valley. This revelation shifted the atmosphere dramatically. What had begun as an intimidation attempt by powerful men against a supposedly vulnerable widow had transformed into a strategic confrontation between equals. As Simmons, Hargrove, and their security detail departed, Sheriff Hollister turned to Eleanor with newfound respect. That was impressive, but also dangerous. You've openly declared yourself as their opponent now. Concealment was no longer viable after last night, Eleanor replied, watching the riders retreat down the road. They know what they're facing now, which changes the nature of the conflict. She turned to the sheriff with resolute determination. What they don't yet realize is that I've been preparing for this moment since I first heard rumors of the railroad's interest in the valley 6 months ago. What happens next? Hollister asked. Eleanor's expression was calm but resolute. Hargrove will regroup and develop a new strategy based on his revised assessment of our capabilities. Simmons will pursue legal and political channels to pressure me through official means. She folded her maps deliberately, and I will continue implementing the defensive campaign I've been planning since before they ever set foot on my property. As Sheriff Hollister departed with promises to expedite his requests for federal assistance, Eleanor gathered her core team in the kitchen to brief them on the new developments. The conflict has expanded beyond direct confrontation, she explained, updating their tactical map. The Blackwater Company now understands they're facing an organized defense rather than a vulnerable target. That's good. It will make them more cautious, less likely to risk overt violence that could substantiate my legal claims against them. But they won't give up, Sam observed. No, Eleanor agreed. They'll adapt. Hargrove is a professional. He'll develop a more sophisticated approach now that intimidation has failed. She traced potential routes of attack on the map. We can expect him to target our supply lines, community support, and legal standing rather than the farm directly. How do we counter that? Martinez asked. Eleanor's expression softened into a small smile. By implementing the next phase of our strategy. They've been reactive until now, responding to our defenses. It's time we seized the initiative. She revealed a previously concealed section of her tactical plans. Thomas always said that the best defense eventually becomes an offense. I think it's time we demonstrated that principle to Mr. Hargrove and the Central Pacific Railroad. As Eleanor outlined her next moves, her team listened with growing admiration. What had begun as a widow's stubborn defense of her farm had evolved into something far more significant, a strategic campaign against corporate power that threatened not just Elmwood Farm, but the independence of the entire Oak Ridge Valley. The battlefield had expanded, the stakes had risen, and Eleanor Sullivan was proving to be a commander worthy of her husband's legacy, and perhaps more formidable than even Colonel Sullivan himself might have been. 3 days after the confrontation with Simmons and Hargrove, Eleanor Sullivan sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by maps, documents, and telegrams. The quiet farmhouse had transformed into a command center for what was rapidly becoming a regional conflict, rather than a simple property dispute. Sam entered with fresh coffee, his expression troubled. Miller's Crossing refused our grain shipment, he reported. Station master said they're having scheduling difficulties and can't guarantee transport. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Right on schedule. Hargrove is targeting our economic viability, just as I predicted. She made a notation on her tactical assessment. Any word from Jenkins? Just got back from town, Sam confirmed. The bank closed his account, and the general store told him they can't extend credit to Elmwood Farm employees anymore. Says it's new company policy. The Central Pacific is applying pressure through their business connections, Eleanor observed calmly. Standard economic isolation tactics. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. And the meeting at Reverend Mitchell's? Set. For noon, Sam replied, though folks seem nervous about being seen associating with us openly. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, gazing out at her fields where the eastern wheat crop continued to thrive despite the supposed pump failure. The irrigation system had been secretly repaired and was operating at night to maintain appearances of distress during daylight hours. Fear is a powerful weapon, Sam, she said quietly. But so is desperation. The Central Pacific has overplayed their hand in this valley. They've created too many victims too quickly. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Martinez entered, escorting a thin, anxious-looking man in a banker's suit. Mrs. Sullivan, Martinez announced formally. Mr. James Whitaker from First Territorial Bank wishes to speak with you. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. Whitaker was the senior loan officer at the region's largest bank, an institution with strong ties to the railroad's financial interests. Mr. Whitaker, she acknowledged, gesturing for him to sit. This is unexpected. The banker glanced nervously at the window before taking a seat. Mrs. Sullivan, I'll be direct. I'm here without my employer's knowledge or approval." "I suspected as much," Eleanor replied. "How can I help you?" Whitaker pulled a thick folder from his briefcase. 3 days ago, I received instructions to call in all outstanding loans to businesses associated with Elmwood Farm, along with neighboring properties that haven't been sold to the railroad." His voice dropped lower. "This came directly from our board chairman after a visit from Mr. Simmons." Eleanor accepted the folder, examining its contents: loan documents, foreclosure notices, and internal bank memoranda outlining a systematic campaign to financially strangle any resistance to the railroad's land acquisition plans. "Why are you showing me this, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked, studying him carefully. The banker squared his shoulders with unexpected resolve. "Because it's wrong, Mrs. Sullivan. I've been with First Territorial for 22 years. We built this institution to serve the community, not destroy it." He leaned forward earnestly. "My own brother-in-law lost his farm last month after similar tactics. They claimed poor harvest projections required immediate loan repayment, leaving him no options." Eleanor processed this information, reassessing Whitaker's potential value. "You're taking a significant risk coming here." "I know," he acknowledged grimly. "But I'm not alone in my concerns. Several bank employees and even 2 board members are uncomfortable with these tactics, though they're afraid to speak publicly." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful glance with Sam. This unexpected development aligned perfectly with the strategy she had been formulating. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "would you be willing to put your concerns in writing? Not for public distribution, but as documentation to support certain legal inquiries." The banker hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I brought notarized copies of key documents showing the pattern of financially targeting railroad opponents." He produced a sealed envelope and my signed statement describing the directives we received. Eleanor accepted the envelope with sincere gratitude. "Your courage is commendable, Mr. Whitaker." "It's not courage, Mrs. Sullivan," he replied wearily. "It's self-preservation. If the Central Pacific succeeds in controlling this valley's economy, through these methods, none of our institutions will remain truly independent." After Whitaker departed, Eleanor immediately incorporated this new information into her evolving strategy. The banker's documents provided crucial evidence of coordinated financial pressure, exactly the kind of documentation that would support legal challenges to the railroad's tactics. "This changes our timeline," she told Sam. "We need to accelerate. The meeting at Reverend Mitchell's. Can you ride to town immediately and adjust the arrangements?" Sam nodded, already moving toward the door. "What should I tell the Reverend?" "Tell him we have banking documents that confirm what everyone has suspected," Eleanor replied, "and that I'm prepared to share my full strategy with those willing to stand together." As Sam departed, Eleanor turned to Martinez. "It's time to implement Phase 2. Send word to Sheriff Hollister that we're ready to proceed with the territorial judge's deposition." The pieces of Eleanor's counter-strategy were falling into place more rapidly than she had anticipated. What had begun as a defensive campaign to protect her farm was evolving into a coordinated resistance against corporate overreach. Exactly the kind of multi-layered operation that Thomas would have admired. Oak Ridge Valley's small white church stood on a gentle rise overlooking the town square. By noon, wagons and horses had begun gathering behind the building, approaching via the less visible rear path as Eleanor had suggested. Inside, the church's meeting room had been arranged with chairs in a semicircle rather than traditional rows, creating an environment of equality and shared purpose that Eleanor had learned was crucial for coalition building. Reverend Mitchell, a tall man with a silvery beard and thoughtful eyes, greeted Eleanor at the side entrance. "Mrs. Sullivan, I must say I'm both impressed and concerned by the turnout. We have representatives from 17 farms and businesses." "More than I expected," Eleanor admitted, surveying the room as it filled with farmers, shopkeepers, and tradespeople, all of whom had experienced the railroad's pressure tactics in recent months. "Word has spread about your stand against the Blackwater Company," the Reverend explained. "You've become something of a symbol, whether you intended it or not." Eleanor had not sought this role, but she recognized its strategic value. Thomas had often discussed how resistance movements required figureheads around whom others could rally. As the meeting began, Eleanor noted the mixture of hope and fear on the faces before her. These were not soldiers or strategists. They were ordinary people whose livelihoods and communities were threatened by forces that seemed overwhelming. "Friends and neighbors," Reverend Mitchell began once everyone was seated, "we gather today not as conspirators, but as citizens concerned about the future of our valley. Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan has requested this meeting to discuss matters affecting us all." Eleanor rose, conscious of the weight of expectation in the room. "Thank you for coming, despite the risks," she began. "I know many of you have already faced consequences for questioning the Central Pacific's methods in our community." She moved to a table where she had arranged key documents, including Whitaker's banking evidence. "For the past 6 months, I've been gathering information about the railroad's activities throughout Oak Ridge Valley, not just their legitimate business operations, but their use of intimidation, sabotage, and financial coercion to acquire properties at reduced prices." Murmurs of recognition spread through the gathering. "The Dawson fire wasn't an accident," called out a weathered farmer. "Same with Miller's cattle breaking through that fence. Been farming 30 years and never seen a herd break through a fence. All at once like that. The mercantile suddenly couldn't get supply deliveries after I refused to sell my lot on Main Street," added a shopkeeper. "Railroad agents said it was transportation difficulties that would resolve once ownership changes. Made shipping more efficient." Similar stories emerged from around the room, a pattern of escalating pressure against anyone who resisted the railroad's expansion plans. Eleanor listened carefully, mentally cataloguing each incident and its implications for her developing strategy. "What you've all experienced isn't coincidental," she explained, once the initial sharing had quieted. "It's a coordinated campaign orchestrated by the Central Pacific through the Blackwater Company." She displayed some of Whitaker's documents. "I now have evidence of their systematic approach to undermining resistance." "Evidence is all well and good, Mrs. Sullivan," said Henry Peterson, who owned the largest grain storage facility in the valley. "But what good is it against a corporation with unlimited resources and political connections all the way to Washington?" It was the critical question Eleanor had been waiting for. "Alone, none of us can match their resources," she acknowledged. "But together, implementing a coordinated strategy, we can create costs they're unwilling to bear." She unrolled a large map of the valley on the central table. "The Central Pacific requires more than just land for their tracks. They need community cooperation, political approval, and most importantly, investor confidence." She marked key points on the map. "Their vulnerability isn't here on the ground. With us, it's in Sacramento and San Francisco, where financial decisions are made based on projected returns and timelines." The room grew quiet as Eleanor outlined her strategy, not merely defensive resistance, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to target the railroad's vulnerabilities while strengthening the community's resilience. First, legal documentation of every questionable incident, creating a pattern of evidence that threatens their regulatory approvals, she explained. Second, coordinated economic cooperation among ourselves to circumvent their financial pressure tactics. And third, strategic communication with investors and territorial officials, raising questions about the project's viability under current management. "You're suggesting we fight a corporation on legal, economic, and political fronts simultaneously," observed Judge Wilson, who had traveled from the county seat specifically for this meeting. That's ambitious. It's necessary, Eleanor corrected firmly. Isolated resistance will fail. Coordinated action across multiple fronts creates compounding pressures they cannot easily counter. As the discussion progressed, Eleanor was reminded of strategy sessions she had observed during the war when Thomas gathered his officers to plan complex operations. The same principles applied: clear objectives, coordinated actions, and most importantly, shared commitment to the outcome. By mid-afternoon, what had begun as a gathering of frightened individuals had transformed into the foundation of an organized resistance. Committees were formed to document incidents, coordinate economic cooperation, and establish secure communication channels. Judge Wilson agreed to collect formal depositions, while Reverend Mitchell offered the church as a neutral meeting ground for ongoing coordination. As the meeting concluded, Robert Dawson, whose barn burning had been among the first incidents in the valley, approached Eleanor privately. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said quietly, "folks are saying you've got military defenses set up at Elmwood, that the Blackwater men tried to burn your crops and you drove them off with some kind of strategic planning." Eleanor studied him carefully. "And if that were true, Mr. Dawson, then I'd say there's about 30 men in this valley with military experience who might be willing to contribute their skills to a well-organized effort," he replied. "Not for violence, you understand, but for strategic preparedness." This was an unexpected development, though not unwelcome. Eleanor had focused her planning on legal and economic strategies, recognizing the risks of direct confrontation against the Blackwater Company's professional operatives. But a community defense network with actual military training could significantly change the tactical landscape. "Have these men meet me at Elmwood tomorrow after dusk," she decided. "We'll discuss how their experience might complement our overall strategy." As Eleanor prepared to depart, Sheriff Hollister arrived with news that shifted the dynamics yet again. "Federal marshals finally responding to my telegrams," he reported in a hushed tone. "They're sending an investigator next week to look into the pattern of intimidation. But there's more. The Territorial Legislature's Special Committee on Railroad Development is reviewing the Central Pacific's right-of-way applications after complaints from several property owners." "The pressure is building," Eleanor observed with satisfaction. "Exactly as planned." Hollister looked impressed, despite his official caution. "You've accomplished more in a week than most could in a year, Eleanor. But be careful. Hargrove won't take this lying down. He'll be watching for your next move." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor replied. "In fact, I've planned for it specifically." As she rode back to Elmwood Farm with Sam and Martinez flanking her wagon as guards, Eleanor reflected on how dramatically the situation had evolved. What had begun as a defense of her property had expanded into a community-wide movement challenging corporate power, a development that would force Hargrove and the Central Pacific to completely recalibrate their approach. "They'll try to infiltrate our new alliance," she told Sam as they approached Elmwood's gates, "probably attempt to identify and pressure key members individually." "How do we counter that?" Sam asked. Eleanor smiled slightly. "By giving them something more immediate to worry about. It's time to implement what Thomas called a calculated demonstration, a clear message about the consequences of continued aggression." Back in her farmhouse study, Eleanor unlocked a cabinet containing her husband's military journals. She located a specific volume marked Asymmetric Response Strategies and began reviewing tactical options that Colonel Sullivan had developed for situations where conventional forces faced more powerful opponents. "The strength of any organization becomes its vulnerability when properly leveraged," Thomas had written. Eleanor traced her finger along the passage, then began drafting instructions for the veterans who would gather at Elmwood the following evening. The conflict had moved beyond defending a single farm. Now it encompasses the future of an entire community, and Eleanor Sullivan, once underestimated as a simple widow, had emerged as the strategic commander of a resistance that would soon demonstrate exactly how costly it could be to threaten what she protected. The evening sun cast long shadows across Elmwood Farm as Eleanor Sullivan stood on her porch watching the discreet arrival of Oak Ridge Valley's veterans. They came in small groups, approaching from different directions to avoid drawing attention, men who had served in the Union Army during the war, now farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, united by concern for their community and respect for Colonel Sullivan's widow, Robert Dawson, who had organized this gathering, made the introductions. "Mrs. Sullivan, most of these men served with your husband at some point. Others heard enough about his tactics to respect what you're trying to do here." Eleanor surveyed the gathering. 34 men in total, ranging from graying veterans of multiple campaigns to younger soldiers who had entered service near the war's end. They stood with the unmistakable bearing of men who had faced combat, their eyes assessing the farmhouse and surrounding terrain with professional interest. "Gentlemen," Eleanor began, "thank you for coming. I understand the risk you're taking. By being here, no greater risk than you've taken standing against Hargrove and his men," replied Michael Thornton, a former cavalry sergeant who now ran the town's livery stable. "Word of what you've accomplished has spread throughout the valley. What I've accomplished so far is merely defensive," Eleanor clarified. "I've prevented the Blackwater Company from intimidating me off my land, but the Central Pacific continues its broader campaign against our community." She led the men into the large barn, which had been prepared for this meeting with maps, diagrams, and a detailed tactical assessment of the current situation. The veterans examined her preparations with growing appreciation, recognizing the hand of someone thoroughly versed in military planning. "The colonel taught you well," observed James Wilson, who had served as a lieutenant under Thomas during the Atlanta campaign. "We taught each other," Eleanor corrected gently. "Thomas provided the formal military framework, but strategic thinking was a shared passion throughout our marriage." For the next hour, Eleanor outlined the evolving conflict and her assessment of the Blackwater Company's likely next moves. The veterans listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions that reflected their combat experience. "Hargrove's men are professionals," Eleanor explained, indicating known Blackwater positions on her map. "They've established observation posts here, and here, monitoring both Elmwood Farm and the movements of our new alliance members. They're gathering intelligence for their next operation, which I believe will target our communication networks and community coordination capability. Cut us off, then pick us apart individually," Thornton summarized. "Standard counterinsurgency approach." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. Which is why we need to disrupt their intelligence gathering and demonstrate that such tactics will prove costly." From a locked chest, she removed detailed plans for what Thomas had called a calculated demonstration, a limited operation designed not to defeat an enemy outright, but to dramatically alter their risk assessment calculations. "Our objective is not to engage the Blackwater Company directly," she emphasized. "That would play to their strengths and potentially provide justification for escalation. Instead, we will implement a coordinated series of actions that undermine their operational capability while remaining within legal boundaries." The plan she presented was both elegant and comprehensive. A carefully orchestrated sequence of moves designed to neutralize Blackwater's surveillance, disrupt their communications, and most importantly, expose their methods to official scrutiny without direct confrontation. "Simultaneous operations at multiple locations," Wilson observed with professional admiration. "Targeting their logistics rather than their personnel. The colonel would approve." "It's brilliant," added Thornton. "They'll know exactly who's responsible, but they'll have no recourse because we're not actually attacking them directly." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Thomas always emphasized targeting an opponent's planning assumptions rather than their visible forces. The Blackwater Company assumes we are reactive, defensive, and limited to conventional responses. We'll demonstrate otherwise. As the meeting progressed, the veterans organized themselves into teams based on their military specialties and current positions in the community. Each group received specific assignments for the coordinated operation scheduled to begin the key. Following night, one final point, Eleanor said, as the planning concluded. This demonstration must remain proportional and disciplined. We are not vigilantes or insurgents. We are citizens protecting our community through strategic action. Any excess or personal vendetta undermines our moral authority and legal standing. The men nodded in solemn agreement, recognizing both the tactical wisdom and ethical imperative in her words. As the veterans departed in the same carefully staggered pattern they had arrived, Sam approached Eleanor with undisguised admiration. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've never seen anything like it. You just organized a military operation with the precision of a general." Eleanor's expression remained thoughtful as she watched the last men disappear into the gathering darkness. "Not a military operation, Sam. A community defense initiative with military discipline." She turned to him with unexpected intensity. "The distinction is crucial, both legally and morally." Back in her study, Eleanor made final notations on her master strategy map. The veterans' participation had expanded her tactical options significantly, but she remained focused on her ultimate objective, not merely defending Elmwood Farm, but compelling the Central Pacific to abandon its coercive approach to the entire valley. "The calculated demonstration will disrupt their immediate operations," she explained to Sam, Jenkins, and Martinez as they reviewed final preparations. "But our legal, economic, and political initiatives must proceed simultaneously, only coordinated. Pressure across all fronts will force the necessary recalculation at corporate headquarters." She pointed to the calendar where she had marked the federal marshal's scheduled arrival and the territorial legislature's upcoming review. "Our timing must be precise. The demonstration occurs tomorrow night. Documentation reaches official channels the following day, and community economic measures activate immediately thereafter." As her team departed to implement their assignments, Eleanor spent a quiet moment at her desk, opening her locket to view Thomas's portrait. "Coordinated operations across multiple domains," she murmured. "Just as you taught me, my love." The following day passed in a tense calm that Eleanor recognized as the stillness before decisive action. Elmwood Farm maintained its normal rhythms, with fieldwork continuing and regular patrols maintaining their established patterns. Nothing in the farm's visible operations suggested the valley-wide activity being quietly coordinated through Eleanor's network of messengers. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Hollister arrived with news that increased both urgency and opportunity. "Victor, Hargrove received reinforcements this morning," he reported, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered in her kitchen. 12 additional Blackwater operatives arrived by private train car. They're staging at the railroad's construction camp north of Miller's Crossing. Eleanor processed this development, mentally adjusting her assessment. They're preparing a significant operation. Hargrove wouldn't bring in additional personnel unless he planned something beyond their usual intimidation tactics. "There's more," Hollister continued. "Edward Simmons has been recalled to Sacramento unexpectedly. Apparently, the Central Pacific's Board of Directors has questions about the situation here in Oak Ridge Valley. This was unexpected, but potentially advantageous information. Our documentation is having an effect at corporate headquarters," Eleanor concluded. "Simmons is being called to account for the methods being employed here." She poured more coffee, thoughtfully. "With Simmons absent, Hargrove will have greater operational autonomy but less political cover." "Is that good or bad for us?" Hollister asked. "Both," Eleanor replied. Hargrove is more dangerous without Simmons's restraining corporate oversight, but also more vulnerable to official scrutiny if he overreaches. She made a quick notation on her planning document. We'll proceed as scheduled, but with heightened awareness of potential escalation. As dusk approached, Eleanor completed her final preparations. The veterans had confirmed their readiness through an ingenious communication system using ordinary commercial deliveries and apparently casual conversations to convey operational updates without detection. Remember, she instructed Sam Jenkins and Martinez as they gathered in the barn for last-minute coordination. Our role at Elmwood is to maintain consistent patterns while monitoring Blackwater reactions. We are the fixed position around which the valley-wide operation revolves. At precisely 9 o'clock, as darkness settled fully over the valley, Eleanor gave the signal, a specific pattern of lantern flashes from the barn loft that would be visible to observers positioned on 3 surrounding ridgelines. Those observers would relay the signal to teams positioned throughout Oak Ridge Valley, initiating the coordinated demonstration. What followed was a masterpiece of strategic orchestration that would have impressed the most seasoned military commanders. Across the valley, the Blackwater Company's careful preparations began to unravel in a sequence of precisely timed disruptions. Their observation posts discovered their supplies mysteriously removed and equipment disabled. Communication routes they had established between positions were blocked by accidental fallen trees or washed-out culverts. Horses they had positioned for rapid response were found with loosened shoes or missing tack. Most dramatically, their field headquarters, established in an abandoned barn near the railroad construction camp, found itself completely surrounded by systematically felled trees that blocked every access route without damaging the structure or threatening any personnel. No direct confrontation occurred. No property was permanently damaged. No individuals were threatened or harmed. Yet by midnight, the Blackwater Company's operational capability throughout Oak Ridge Valley had been thoroughly compromised through dozens of small, coordinated actions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their positions and methods. From her command position in the Elmwood Farm barn loft, Eleanor tracked the progression of events through prearranged signals and messenger reports. The veterans had executed their assignments with professional precision, maintaining the disciplined approach she had emphasized. Shortly after midnight, the reaction she had anticipated arrived at Elmwood's gates. Victor Hargrove himself, accompanied by 4 of his senior operatives, their expressions grim in the moonlight as Sam escorted them to the house. Eleanor received them in her parlor, dressed not in her usual farm attire, but in a more formal dress that subtly emphasized her transition from merely defending her property to leading a community response. Sheriff Hollister sat nearby, his presence ensuring the meeting remained within legal boundaries. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hargrove began without preamble, "I believe we need to reassess our respective positions." Eleanor gestured for him to continue, maintaining a composed silence that forced him to elaborate. "The activities throughout the valley tonight represent a significant escalation," he stated, his tone carefully neutral despite the anger evident in his posture. "My organization has experienced coordinated interference with our legitimate security operations." "How unfortunate," Eleanor replied evenly. "Though I'm curious why a private security company would maintain such extensive operations in our valley without public knowledge or official authorization." Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're contracted to protect the Central Pacific's interests in the region." "Ah," Eleanor nodded. "And does that contract specify the methods employed? Sabotage, intimidation, surveillance of private citizens? I wonder if the railroad's board of directors is fully informed about those operational details." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hargrove's face. confirming Eleanor's suspicion that Simmons's recall to Sacramento indicated corporate concern about methods being employed in Oak Ridge Valley. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hargrove said after a measured pause, "I'm a professional. I recognize a sophisticated operation when I encounter one. Tonight's activities demonstrated tactical coordination that goes well beyond typical community resistance. The citizens of Oak Ridge Valley are more resourceful than you anticipated," Eleanor observed. "The citizens of Oak Ridge Valley," Hargrove countered, "are suddenly employing military-grade coordination and counter-surveillance techniques that coincidentally mirror strategies documented in Colonel Sullivan's field manuals." His gaze intensified. "Manuals I studied during my own military service," Eleanor smiled slightly. "My husband believed in sharing his knowledge with those who might need it." The implied confirmation hung between them, an acknowledgement between professionals that elevated their conversation beyond threats or denials. "You've transformed this situation from a standard land acquisition campaign into something significantly more complex," Hargrove observed, his tone shifting from confrontational to evaluative. "The cost-benefit analysis has changed." "That was precisely the intention," Eleanor confirmed. "Continued pressure against this community now carries costs that exceed any reasonable projection of benefits." Sheriff Hollister shifted slightly in his chair, clearly impressed by the clinical strategic exchange taking place before him. "The Central Pacific has substantial resources," Hargrove noted. "They could escalate further." "They could," Eleanor agreed, "but consider what arrives in this valley over the next 72 hours. A federal marshal investigating intimidation claims, territorial legislators reviewing right-of-way approvals, and journalists responding to documented allegations of corporate coercion." She leaned forward slightly. "Each escalation by your company would only amplify scrutiny of methods that I suspect exceed your actual corporate authorization." Hargrove studied her with new appreciation. "You've been planning this response since before we ever approached your farm, haven't you?" "Since the first mysterious fire at the Dawson property," Eleanor confirmed. "Strategic defense requires anticipation, not merely reaction." For several moments, Hargrove sat in contemplative silence, visibly reassessing the entire campaign he had been directing. Eleanor recognized the calculation happening behind his professional facade, the same process Thomas had described observing opposing commanders when they realized their position had become untenable. "I will need to consult with my principals," Hargrove finally said, rising to his feet with military precision. "In the meantime, I propose a mutual standing down of operational activities." "Agreed," Eleanor replied, "contingent upon complete cessation of all intimidation and surveillance against community members." "Understood." Hargrove's nod held the formal acknowledgement of one tactician to another. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Sullivan, Colonel Sullivan would be impressed by what you've accomplished here. Thomas always said that the best victory is the one where your opponent chooses to withdraw," Eleanor replied quietly. After Hargrove and his men departed, Sheriff Hollister let out a long, low whistle of amazement. "I've never seen anything like that, Eleanor. You just negotiated a ceasefire with one of the most notorious security operations in the West." "It's not over," Eleanor cautioned. "Hargrove will report to his superiors. The Central Pacific will reassess. We need to maintain our preparation and coordination until we see concrete changes in their approach." Throughout the night, reports continued to arrive from across the valley, all confirming the success of the coordinated demonstration. By dawn, the Blackwater Company had withdrawn to their base camp, suspending all field operations just as Hargrove had promised. Eleanor gathered her core team and key veterans at Elmwood Farm to assess results and plan next steps. The mood was cautiously triumphant, but she emphasized the importance of continued vigilance. "We've created a strategic pause," she explained. "The Central Pacific is reassessing the costs and methods of their expansion through our valley. But corporations rarely abandon their objectives completely. They typically seek alternative approaches." "What happens next?" Thornton asked. "We maintain coordination while simultaneously escalating our legal and political initiatives," Eleanor replied. "The arrival of the federal marshal gives us an opportunity to document everything that's occurred. The territorial legislature's review creates leverage for a negotiated solution that respects property rights and community interests." Over the next 3 days, Oak Ridge Valley experienced an unusual calm. The Blackwater Company remained confined to their base camp, while community members moved freely about their business for the first time in months. Eleanor used this period to consolidate the alliance she had formed, establishing more formal structures for ongoing coordination and mutual support. On the 4th day, change came from an unexpected direction. A private rail car arrived at Miller's Crossing, carrying not reinforcements for Hargrove, but Lawrence Chambers, Vice President of Operations for the Central Pacific Railroad, accompanied by legal representatives and engineering consultants. Sheriff Hollister brought news of their arrival directly to Eleanor. "Chambers has requested a meeting with community representatives at the town hall," he reported. "Formal invitation, very respectful in tone. No sign of Hargrove or his men." Eleanor considered this development carefully. "Corporate headquarters are taking direct control of the situation," she concluded. "They've likely decided that Simmons's methods were creating more problems than solutions." The meeting that followed in Oak Ridge's modest town hall represented a dramatic shift in dynamics. Where Simmons had employed threats and Hargrove had used intimidation, Chambers approached the community with professional respect and genuine negotiation. The Central Pacific Railroad acknowledges concerns about the methods employed in our recent expansion efforts, Chambers stated to the gathered community representatives, with Eleanor positioned prominently among them. "We are reviewing our approach to land acquisition and community relations throughout the territory." What followed was a substantive discussion of the railroad's actual needs versus their previous demands. The alternative route that Eleanor had identified, passing east of Elmwood Farm rather than through it, was examined by the engineers present and acknowledged as viable, though requiring some additional construction costs. "Our primary interest is establishing efficient transportation infrastructure that serves both the railroad's commercial needs and the community's economic development," Chambers explained. "If that can be accomplished without the contentious acquisition of certain properties, we're prepared to modify our planning accordingly." Eleanor, who had anticipated this potential outcome in her strategic planning, was ready with a counter-proposal. "The community understands the value of railroad access," she acknowledged. "We propose a cooperative approach, voluntary right-of-way, grants along the eastern route, with guaranteed water rights protection and fair compensation for affected properties." The negotiation continued for hours, delving into technical details and legal frameworks that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Eleanor's thorough preparation and strategic foresight enabled the community representatives to engage as equals rather than supplicants, establishing terms that balance railroad development with community protection. By evening, a preliminary agreement had been reached, one that would allow the Central Pacific to establish their spur line through Oak Ridge Valley, while respecting property rights, water access, and local economic interests. Most significantly, the Blackwater Company would be withdrawn completely, with security for construction provided by regular railroad employees under sheriff's oversight. As the meeting concluded, Chambers approached Eleanor privately. "Mrs. Sullivan, I must say you've earned my professional respect. It's not often that a local community organizes such an effective response to corporate initiatives." "We're merely protecting our homes and livelihoods, Mr. Chambers," Eleanor replied, "something I believe can be accomplished without resorting to the tactics Mr. Simmons embraced." Chambers nodded thoughtfully. "Simmons has been reassigned to our northern territories. His approach created liability exposures that our board found concerning." He studied her with genuine curiosity. "If I may ask, how did you manage to coordinate such a sophisticated response? Our reports indicate tactical disruption of surveillance that suggests military-grade planning." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Oak Ridge Valley sent many sons to serve during the war, Mr. Chambers. They returned with valuable skills and a deep commitment to their community." She paused before adding, "And some of us who remained behind learned to think strategically out of necessity." As Chambers departed, promising formal documentation of their agreement within days, the community representatives gathered around Eleanor with expressions of triumph and gratitude. "You did it," Reverend Mitchell said wonderingly. "You actually forced the Central Pacific to negotiate fairly." "We did it," Eleanor corrected firmly. "A single farm could not have accomplished this outcome. Only coordinated community action created sufficient leverage to change their calculation." In the days that followed, Eleanor watched with satisfaction as the preliminary agreement transformed into binding legal documents. The federal marshal's investigation documented the pattern of intimidation tactics, creating official records that would prevent future recurrence. Most visibly, the Blackwater Company packed their equipment and personnel onto a train bound for Sacramento, their services deemed no longer required by the revised railroad development plan. 1 month after the night of the coordinated demonstration, Eleanor Sullivan stood on her porch, watching surveyors marking the revised railroad route that would pass east of Elmwood Farm, preserving both her property and her water rights, while still bringing the economic benefits of rail access to the valley. Sam joined her, his expression reflecting the community's lingering amazement at what they had accomplished. "When they first came with torches for your wheat field, did you ever imagine it would end like this?" Eleanor smiled, her thoughts turning to Thomas and the strategic principles they had developed together over years of intellectual partnership. "Not precisely like this," she admitted, "but I knew that proper strategic defense always considers the ultimate objective, not merely immediate survival." She gazed out over her thriving fields, then to the community beyond where neighbors now moved without fear of intimidation or coercion. They thought they were targeting a vulnerable widow with a desirable farm, she reflected. They didn't realize they were challenging someone who had helped plan the defense of Antietam. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elmwood Farm, Eleanor Sullivan contemplated the future with renewed confidence. The Central Pacific would build their spur line and bring economic opportunity to Oak Ridge Valley, but they would do so as partners rather than conquerors. The community had discovered its collective strength, establishing coordination mechanisms that would serve them long after the current conflict faded into memory. And Eleanor herself had stepped fully into her own identity, no longer merely Colonel Sullivan's widow preserving his legacy, but a strategic leader in her own right, whose defense of a single farm had transformed into the protection of an entire community. Thomas would have been proud, she knew, not because she had applied his tactical principles perfectly, but because she had adapted and extended them to serve a cause greater than either of them had originally envisioned. A battlefield is anywhere. People choose to make a stand, Thomas had often said. Eleanor Sullivan had proven that wisdom extended far beyond military conflicts to the everyday struggles of communities against powerful interests, and that sometimes the most effective commander might be a widow with a farm and the courage to defend what mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.